I used to work search and rescue around the Cascades back in the 80s. In the late summer of 87, bright and early one Tuesday morning, we got a call that ended up being one of the scariest I was ever involved in. A solo hiker had been reported missing after heading out on the trails the day before. Now, I'll just call him Robert, and it was his sister that had reported him missing, saying that he'd mentioned hitting the trails near the Black Ridge to let off some steam and make the most of the good weather. Now, she said that he knew the area well, as he'd hiked up there more times than she could remember. But then that Monday, Robert didn't come home, and so she called the cops. It looked to be a pretty standard missing hiker op. The guy was fit, healthy, and experienced, and he knew how to read a map, and he carried the actual equipment necessary with him. And we figured that we'd find him within the first 24 hours or so, most likely with some kind of injury, and we did find him all right, just not in any kind of state that we figured we would. And to this day, just thinking about it can send a shiver or two up my own spine. By the time we launched the rescue op in earnest, Robert had been missing for coming up on 72 hours. The weather had turned wet, and while the rain wasn't all that bad, the mud up near Black Ridge was ankle deep in parts, the kind that tries to pull your whole damn boots off. Now, we started at the trailhead where his truck was still parked and then fanned out as far and wide as we could to cover the most possible ground. And like I said, we were really hopeful given the circumstances, but all we found that first day were just boot prints of the same brand that Robert wore. That was obviously great news because it meant that we had a trail, right? But Jesus, what that trail led us to is something obviously I'll never forget. And the second day, we came to sections of boot prints that had been washed out by the rain, meaning accurately tracking Robert's movements was getting harder and harder. But then, one of the dog teams hit on something. About 2 miles in, we found Robert's water bottle just sitting off the side of the trail like he'd set it down and forgotten to pick it back up again. Now, there was still a little water in it too. Not a lot, but not so little a person might abandon it. And I guess that looking back on it, that's probably the point that we should have realized that things weren't as they seemed. A few miles away from the bottle, we found one of Robert's gloves, and then not far away from there, the other glove. And that's when it really hit that something was wrong and he most likely wasn't himself. But leaving things behind like that in what could have been an orderly fashion, it also suggested that he might be leading us someplace. One of our team suggested that something might have been pursuing him out of the area he knew that we might search. And so while that shedding gear behavior was definitely the first red flag that we spotted, no one automatically assumed the worst. So we kept on following the trail of scattered gear until we came to the next thing, his pack. It had been dumped in this thicket, the contents spilled out on the ground beside it, and after fishing it out, we saw the straps had been cut. Now, why he'd do something like that was completely beyond us, and the only thing that came to mind was way too creepy to even entertain. One of the guys said it was like something had grabbed him by the pack while he was still wearing it. If it was something big enough, like a bear or maybe even a mountain lion, it made sense that he'd have to cut through his straps to free himself. But there was no sign of any struggle, no blood or viscera to suggest that there had been an attack. And it was while we were scratching our heads over that little mystery that someone called us over to where the bag had been found. And like I mentioned, a bunch of its contents had spilled out, apparently after being tossed into the bushes. There were food items, a notebook, and some items of clothing, but each and every one showed signs that our missing hiker was not of sound mind. First off, all of the food left behind had been tampered with, and by that I mean Robert appeared to have opened and taken a bite out of each item before abandoning it, with some items, such as these individually packaged granola bars, looking like Robert had bitten through the packaging. Now I know what you're probably thinking. Couldn't an animal have come along and bitten through the packaging as well? And while that'd be a great question, the bite pattern showed that it must have been a human. Maybe not Robert himself, but definitely a human being. And then, seeing as we were in such a remote area, the chances of it not being Robert were basically slim to none. And then, there was the matter of Robert's notebook. Based on the first half of what had been written, it was clear that Robert had been using it as some kind of trail diary. There were entries of Maple Loop and Diablo Lake, but then as we got into the section which detailed the hike Robert had disappeared on, that's where things got weird. He'd written sentences that stopped halfway through, and then he'd just move on to the next like the previous was finished and made total sense. The handwriting got progressively worse too, to the point that we could barely make out any of the words. The last entry was little more than looping scribbles with only words like lights, moving, or trees being legible. And then there was this one part, something about being watched from the rocks, that sent an actual chill down my spine when I came across the sentence. Robert was clearly in a bad way, and we'd gone from expecting to find a warm body in around 24 hours to wondering if we were ever going to find him at all, especially after we found his boots. We came across both of them, laced, untied, with socks stuffed in them, sitting all neatly on a rock. And there was a sort of calmness about how they'd been displayed, an order to it, like Robert wasn't crazy at all. But to walk away from them, to just keep on walking through the woods with, from what we could tell, no footwear to speak of, we knew right there that he'd probably lost his mind. A couple of guys stayed behind to bag up all of Robert's belongings for the benefit of the county sheriff, and the rest of us kept moving, and less than a mile away, we started to find the rest of Robert's clothing. We found the shirt first, buttons were ripped, and then the pants, and his underwear last. All were in a rough line heading off trail towards some limestone outcropping. Now, Command figured that there was a chance that he'd been hypothermic and had stripped off of his clothes in that classic paradox of feeling warm when you're actually dying. It happens more than people think, and it doesn't make it any less concerning, but it's true that it's not totally uncommon. And so as we approached that sort of limestone, we widened the grid and said a little prayer that we'd find Robert alive. We had the chopper in the air on day 5, and once the weather was clear enough. We tried not to put too much faith in the crew, purely to preserve our own sanity. But then that afternoon, they got a sighting way up near that outcrop that I mentioned. The crew had spotted someone up near the outcrop moving near the mouth of the cave system up on the north face. They seemed to be sure it was Robert, and when our team leader asked why over the radio, they pretty much came back with, "Because the guy's naked." And that lifted our spirits a little, knowing that he was alive, but the fact that he seemed to be hanging out in a cave system filled us with dread. And this is why. Now, according to the rangers that we liaise with, Robert had been spotted near some old solution caves, as they're called. And these are the most common sort of cave there is and are formed by acidic groundwater, meaning some damp caverns are way bigger than others, and there are plenty of smaller passageways that a person could get stuck in, especially should they panic and get themselves lost. Ariel put eyes on a figure crawling inside, the body very pale against the dark rock, and so if Robert had lost his mind, we knew that we had to get to him before he got himself lost, stuck, or worse. And I was on the team that went in. There were 4 of us, all equipped with headlamps, radios that half worked underground, and all of our important ropes. I remember how cold and damp the air was, and how there was this sort of metallic smell. Something like rusted iron, really, and cave systems aren't known for smelling great or anything like that, but I ain't never smelled one like that before. We called out Robert's name every 20 yards or so, and while the passageways and caverns were pretty wide to begin with, they started to gradually close in on us the further that we pushed on. And that's when we found even more signs of Robert's mental deterioration. There were smears of what looked to be mud on some of the walls, obviously fresh, as time and the damp would have washed them away had they not been put there recently. And there was also gouge marks in the softer limestone. 4 scrapes, then another 4, which someone had been scratching at the wall, and really hard too, using nothing but their fingers. There were longer scrape marks further down the tunnel where someone, most likely Robert, had pushed their fingernails into the wall before dragging them along. There was this little smear of blood on one of them, then one of the team looking down to point their headlamp at the ground, and there it was. One of Robert's fingernails had been torn off by a particular stubborn section of stone. And as we moved deeper, the passageway that we were in opened up into a low chamber, and that's when we first heard movement. There was a scuffling noise, and then the sound of unsteady breathing, and then all of our headlamps were on him at once. He was naked and covered in mud and scratches with these long red lines down his arms and chest like he'd clawed at his own skin. His hair looked matted into these clumps and his face was streaked with dirt. He looked like an animal, but of all the things that gave me the chills, even all this time later, it's Robert's eyes that top that list. They didn't blink. He just stared with this look of anger on his face until one of us tried to ID him. Then, he came at us, or at least what was left of him did. He didn't scream or shout, he just rushed at us in almost total silence, and the only sound being his heavy breathing. But the look on his face, and particularly in his eyes like I mentioned, it was clear that he wanted to hurt us. A guy named Alan was closest to him, so that's who we went for first. Alan tried to steady himself and grab at him, but Robert slammed into him so hard, he knocked him into the wall so hard that his headlamp spun off and rolled away. And then as the beam of light coming from Alan's headlamp circled around us like this weird sort of disco ball, Robert sank his teeth into the flesh of Alan's forearm. Now, Alan was a tough guy. He'd been on maybe 20 or so SNR ops by that point, and he'd seen and been through a lot of crap. But the scream that he let out as Robert's teeth broke the skin of his arm, I've never heard a man so terrified in all my life. He was screaming, "Get him off me! Get him off me!" while Robert shook his head like a dog trying to tear meat from the bone. We had to apply pressure to both sides of his jaw, almost enough to break it before Alan was able to yank his arm away. And after that, it was a case of piling on and getting him restrained, but he fought us like a man possessed. He was thrashing, trying his absolute damnedest to bite at us, and he even started scraping his teeth against the rock for a second once we had him down. And it was me that had to jerk his head to the side and pin it so he couldn't do his teeth any serious damage. He was really strong for a guy who had been missing almost a week. He'd abandoned all of his food and water in the days before, but he must have been getting sustenance from somewhere, or he'd have never been able to fight us like he did. But from where? It was a struggle, but we got the cuffs and straps on him eventually. We carried them for psych cases, though we usually didn't use them, and after that, he just went limp for a while. He didn't pass out or anything, he just went quiet and stopped moving. Like his eyes were open while we were moving him, but he was just staring off at nothing, like he'd just given up all of a sudden. 3 of us hauled him out, with Alan close behind holding his bandaged arm, and he went straight to the medics on scene, who found deep punctures to his arm and then later to the hospital for some stitches and a tetanus shot. Robert was placed in a stretcher, wrapped in blankets and then transported down the mountain. He never said a single word the whole way. He just laid there with his eyes wide open, staring up at nothing. I later heard that at one point the stretcher kind of jolted after it hit a root or something. One of the guys walking nearby cursed, something out of a scare anyways, and then they saw Robert smiling. They only saw it for a split second, just this flash of blood-stained teeth, and then it was gone, and his face was blank again. Now, from the hospital, we later heard that he was transferred to the state psych facility once they figured out what kind of state that he was in. They tested him for head trauma, drugs, all kinds of things, but the only explanation was a sort of acute psychotic break, meaning Robert just went out hiking one day, then spontaneously and completely lost his mind. He stayed mute for weeks and then started talking in fragments when they got him on meds. He said he didn't remember anything past a certain point on his hike, but he did remember attacking us. I heard Robert broke down in tears as the memories came back to him, and then when asked why he attacked us, all he said was that he remembered being confused and scared. He was convinced that we were there to kill him, and so he did the only thing he could think to do at the time and attempted to defend himself. I heard his family went to visit him at the hospital, and I heard it was bad. Robert's sister said that she could barely recognize him anymore, and it was like the boy that she'd grown up with and the man that he'd become were just gone. Doctors did their thing, put him through all kinds of tests and examinations, but they never did figure out what had caused his mental break. Something had to be written in his file, though, so the official explanation became survival-induced psychosis. But between you and me, That was just a rubber stamp so the authorities could close the book on it, and all without ever really digging into what happened to the guy. Man got lost, man panics, and then snaps from the sheer stress and isolation. The report barely even mentioned the bite. It just said Robert attacked the S&R team and that one of them required medical treatment. But to us, that didn't cover the extent of what happened at all. We never did get a full explanation. Robert's case got filed away with 1,000 others like it was no different from them. But let me tell you, if there ever was a case worthy of opening up a freaking X-file for S&R ops, it was that one, because it was unlike any I'd ever been on before, and any I went on after. My grandfather was a World War II vet. He had a bunch of medals and stuff from it too, but for the longest time, us kids only knew him as the quiet old guy who sat on the porch and smoked his pipe. Now, he didn't talk a whole lot about the war. Most of those fellas didn't. But every once in a while as we got older, usually after a couple of beers on Memorial Day or something like that, he'd open up a little and tell us a story or two. Now, he kept it all very PG-13 at first and kept the darker stories to himself. But then one Thanksgiving, after everyone else had retired and it was just me and him watching old movies, he told me one that he never told anyone before, let alone Grandma or my dad. And let me tell you, it'll be one that I remember for as long as I live, and I hope to share it with you. So, just a little backstory. Grandpa enlisted in 1942 after Pearl Harbor and ended up as a bosun's mate on a smaller vessel doing search and rescue work out in the Pacific. Now, it wasn't the glamorous stuff that you see in the movies, not by any stretch, but it was a very important job, because once they got word a ship had gone down, be it a merchantman, transport, destroyer, whatever they had hit, the enemy that is, he and his crew would go out looking for survivors. They'd be looking for rafts, lifeboats, guys floating in life jackets, and sometimes they'd find them, sometimes they wouldn't, because Lord knows there's a lot of empty ocean out there. It was a tough gig too. They had to worry about the heat, the salt, and the way that the sun beat down on everything until their eyes burned. And then there were the days that they came back empty-handed with nothing but the feeling that the sea had already claimed whoever they were looking for. But Grandpa said the toughest day of all came in early 1944, when they happened across something that can only really be described as a crime against humanity. Grandpa and his boys were out looking for the crew of a freighter that had been torpedoed somewhere east of the Marshalls. They searched the whole day, dawn until dusk, and came up Snake Eyes. But then on the way back, they suddenly spotted something on a beach on a little atoll that wasn't supposed to have anybody on it. And they decided to sail a little closer to get a clearer picture. And then after looking through the ship's telescope, they saw that it was a big piece of shipwreck, washed up right there on the shoreline. Now, they were under orders to investigate any potential signs of life, so even though the wreckage didn't appear to belong to the freighter that they were looking for, they diverted to go check it out. They make landfall, and then head into the jungle to go looking for survivors, and while they found people, they found them in unimaginable conditions, because it wasn't the crew of the freighter, but the survivors of a civilian transport that had gone down months earlier in the same general area. It was a passenger ship, so the survivors were a mixed bunch and included about a dozen families, some government folks, along with merchants trying to get somewhere safer. Apparently they got caught in a storm which had blown them way off course, and after hitting some rocks, some of the survivors washed up on that tiny little island that they were on. Grandpa said it was maybe half a mile long, coral and shrub, really nothing much, just rocks and thorns and the constant sound of the waves chewing at the edges. They had no radio, no real food beyond what they could scavenge, and their fresh water was limited to a couple brackish pools and whatever rain they could catch. Things were tough, and there were a lot of worried survivors, but we were told that there was also a kind of commonly shared hope that sooner or later they'd be found. And by the time my grandpa's boat got there, things had gone bad, really bad, worse than anyone could make sense of at first. We were told that around 70 people survived the wreck and successfully made it to the island without drowning in the surf. But by the time my grandpa showed up, there were no more than 40. Some died as a result of injuries sustained in the wreck, and some of the weaker ones just gave out from thirst and heat. But not everyone died that way. The ones my grandpa found had broken off into something that wasn't a group of survivors anymore. It was more like a tribe, a brutal little kingdom built out of desperation and a complete lack of hope. Apparently, there came a point where some survivors realized that they were too far off course for the search parties to find them, meaning that they had to just wait to get lucky. It turns out the probability was way higher than they thought because obviously they only spent a few months on the island before they were found. But I guess at some point they worked themselves up into such a frenzy of despair that they ended up losing all hope of being found, and that's when things got really bad. After a brief power struggle, it was the stronger ones, mostly the younger men, who took over completely. At first, they did it through controlling drinking water, but they expanded by gaining control of the hunting and foraging that went on, meaning people either worked for them or they didn't eat. And this was all done in the name of survival, of course, with the new elites claiming everything was for the benefit of the collective, but the only people who seemed to benefit were them. The island's workforce was mostly women, kids, and older folks, and it was them that did all the gathering and the foraging and most of the fishing, too. The younger men either hunted wild pigs, which they were apparently very successful at, or sat around drinking liquor that they made out of coconut water or something. I never quite got the details on that or how they did it. But having them all drunk all the time meant that if someone below their station talked back or even tried to take more than their share, they got beaten. Or sometimes they got worse, which also explained why there were only around 40 survivors instead of the full original complement of 70. Grandpa said he and his buddies could see the hierarchy among the survivors the second they found them. The ones in charge sat in the shade of the only real trees, looking thin and mean-eyed, while the others moved like they were already half ghosts. Some of the survivors just about lost their minds with joy when they spotted a bunch of Americans, but Grandpa said the scene was still anything but happy. He remembered how broken everyone seemed, how they cried, but he also said that he remembered the stench. Not just the usual island rot or the salt, but something heavier, like fear, unwashed bodies, and old blood, all mixed up to something far more terrible than the individual parts. Some of the survivors looked at the landing party like they weren't sure if the sailors were real or just some kind of hallucinations. No crying, no questions, just sort of watching. Grandpa said that he didn't understand why at first, that he thought everyone would be happy to see them. But after he and his boys pieced everything together, their muted reactions started making a horrible kind of sense. They were told that any kind of conflict between survivors was settled with fists, and if the grievance was big enough, whatever sharp piece of coral or driftwood was handy. About a dozen people died that way, murdered in what were basically these gladiatorial fights that everyone gathered around to watch under pain of death. Grandpa said he saw the survivor of one of those fights, lying in the shade of a tree just waiting to die with his wife and one surviving kid kneeling near him. His bruises up and down his broken ribs had gone red and swollen from where infection was settling in, and he had cuts that hadn't healed right and were still weeping. There was also a couple of men who had some real bad limps from legs that had been broken and never set, but Grandpa was told the breaks had been inflicted as punishments for stealing food. Now, one of the survivors later told them that two of the original group had been killed in fights over the water supply early on. One strangled the other to death, but the dead man hit his opponent so hard over the head with a rock that he died less than a day later. Another man had been left out in the open sun for a full day as punishment for stealing a handful of fish, and he didn't make it through the night after that. All of their bodies were just pushed out into the lagoon for the sharks and the tide. Overall, Grandpa said it was the women who had it the worst. To him, it seemed like they were seen more like property than people by those in charge. And it makes my skin crawl to write this, but they got shared around among the ones in charge like tools or rations. Any man who tried to protect his wife or daughter got beaten until he couldn't stand, or worse, made to watch while the leaders reminded everyone who held the power. He said one of the older men had tried to organize a kind of strike where the workers didn't work until conditions improved. They broke his hand so he couldn't work or fight and then denied him water until he died. After that, nobody argued much. There was no law but the fist and the threat of being cut off from the only things that kept you alive. When Grandpa and his crew first came across the group of survivors, their quote-unquote leaders tried to play it like they were just survivors holding things together, doing what they had to do. Grandpa was later told about one of them who tried explaining the terrible conditions with the excuse that it was what people needed. He talked about how they'd only been so brutal to keep order and how the weak had to make way so the strong can survive. He tried to make out that they were the good guys, but Grandpa and his boys saw the fear in the eyes of the others, the way people flinched when certain men raised their voices. One of the women managed to whisper something to a corpsman while they were checking her over. Something about how the younger men decided who lived and who didn't when the water got low. And that was all it took for sailors to start asking questions, and the whole rotten setup started coming out in pieces. Accusations, names, stories that made the hair on your arm stand up even in that heat. And it didn't end quietly. 3 of those self-appointed bosses decided that they weren't going to give up control, and one of them, who had a knife made of sharpened metal taken from the wreckage of their boats, straight up attacked them. Grandpa was right there when it happened, and said the fight was as short as it was ugly. The man came at one of the sailors swinging, screaming that the island was theirs now, and that no one had the right to take it away from them. They had to shoot the guy with the knife, and then as he went down, another charged them, and so he was shot dead too. The third tried to grab a woman and drag her off into the jungle to do God knows what to her, but he was pursued, surrounded, and then talked into giving himself up before anyone else got hurt. Once all the leaders were detained or dead, the rest of the survivors went through a kind of emotional collapse. Some started crying, and not like soft weeping either. Grandpa said that they were loud, broken sounds that sounded like they were being held in for weeks at that point. Others just stared at the ground, completely empty, like all that violence at the end had burned what little humanity they had left in them. Now, a few of the stronger ones who hadn't been part of that sadistic ruling class helped the survivors get everybody up and onto the boats. More had turned up to help ferry the survivors, and they too couldn't believe what they were seeing. There also wasn't enough room for certain families to travel together, and thanks to the language barrier, it was hard to explain that they were being separated. Some refused to let go of each other and even tried fighting us when we tried prying them apart, but somehow, and thankfully, some kind of communication was established and things calmed down enough for the evacuation to commence. The survivors ended up being taken to a hospital ship. There, they were found to be severely dehydrated, with infected wounds and broken bones that had set wrong, and that was just the physical damage. The psychological damage was a whole other mess entirely. Grandpa said a few of them seemed like they weren't coming back from it. They were the ones who had nightmares about the island, who woke up in their hospital beds in the middle of the night thinking that they were still there and they could never escape it. One guy used to cry almost constantly, saying in broken English how the weak ones were left for the sun, and the rest acted like the sailors taking care of them were just as bad as the elites on the island, and even the politest interaction seemed to imply the threat of violence to them. He said the Navy ended up classifying a lot of the details, so the only info on the island spread by word of mouth, and even then it only spread through whispers and rumor. They made it sound like a standard rescue op to recover storm survivors. Officially, the ones who died in the fighting were listed as Japanese-aligned enemy combatants, which meant that there was never any formal investigation into their deaths like there would be for any other civilian. Once they'd been treated, and all made recoveries full, the survivors were scattered to different places. Not their countries of origin either, just the closest convenient ports. And so even after all that, they still had to struggle to make it home once the war was over. At least that's what Grandpa assumed happened, and they didn't just decide to make their homes elsewhere. I guess I'm not great with the details on this, but you can't blame me. Grandpa only ever told me the story probably one time. He said it stayed with him more than anything else, because while war was one thing, it was something else to see people having turned into something less than human, and all because they simply run out of hope. He never mentioned the island again, but he often remarked on how thin that civilized line was and how quick it could disappear. I think about it sometimes when people talk about how civilized we all are. Grandpa would just shake his head, said the ocean doesn't care about civilization, and neither does a man who decides the only law left is the one he can enforce with his fists. People ask me all the time what's the worst call I ever worked, and most of them expect some story about a kid who fell through ice or a hiker who just gave out from exposure. Now don't get me wrong, those can be bad. In fact, anything which involves kids ends up coming back to visit you late at night when the mind's not quite as strong as it is during the daylight. But one that sticks with me even more than the others was what happened to those 3 campers up in the Rockies during the autumn of '99. I was on the county search and rescue team by then, and I've been out of the Army for about 6 years at this point. I did 1 tour of Iraq, 2 tours of Afghanistan, and then decided 3 tours would do me just fine, and separated. I tried doing some private security stuff after, just to pad that little nest egg that I had left over from the military. But that felt like I was wearing down my luck a little too thin, so I quit, shopped around for a while, and then settled on search and rescue. Now it seems simple. You go out, you find people, you bring them home. Now most days that's exactly what happens, and even on the days that it didn't, it was better than getting shot at. But then with this Rockies operation back in 1999, while the search itself was pretty simple, the aftermath has stayed with me ever since. Now the call came late one afternoon saying 3 guys in their 20s, I think they were college buddies, had failed to check in after their weekend of hiking and camping. Now, the cars were still parked at the entrance to the trail with no notes or anything slid under the wipers. And then since the weather was good, we expected to find them relatively quickly. Unless, of course, something had gone horribly wrong, which it had. Now, we staged at the trailhead that evening, got the dogs out, waited for volunteers, the whole circus. And then I was assigned the primary search grid along with 2 other guys that I'd worked with for years by then. And like I said, we were confident that we'd find our missing hikers, and we found one of them that very next morning. He just wasn't anywhere near the condition that we were hoping for. We found him about 4 miles in, sitting on a rock beside a lake like he was just out there waiting for us to find him. And I guess everyone's waiting to be found in that kind of situation, so let me elaborate. When we find people, their reaction is usually along the lines of, "Oh my God, thank you so much." They cry, they laugh, heck, sometimes they pass out with exhaustion and from knowing that they were finally saved. But this guy, Rob or Bob I think his name was, he just raised a hand very slow-like and sort of something similar to a kid in a classroom saying, "Present," or "Here." And I guess he had to be in his early 20s, clean-shaven with his clothes a little dirty but not completely torn up. He didn't have any injuries, but he didn't look great. And he was just sitting there staring at the water. But above all else, I remember his face more than I remember his name or what he was wearing. The first thing that hit me was how calm he was. Like I said, people get super emotional, but there was Rob or Bob just looking like we'd walked in on his coffee break. We asked where his buddies were, these 2 guys named Mark and Ben. But Rob said he had no idea, that he just woke up one morning and found both of their tents were just empty. There were no tracks leading away that he could see, no gear missing except what they were wearing, and so he went looking for them. Said he searched for hours too, just yelling until his voice gave out. It wasn't long before he was lost, and then when he realized it, he just stopped where he was and stayed put because he heard that that's what you're supposed to do. We tried to find his friends, and we worked the grids hard too. Dogs, drones even, ground teams, even a helicopter for aerial photography. But we found nothing, not even a scrap of clothing or so much as a footprint that didn't belong to Rob or us. And all the tents were still pitched in their original spots, sleeping bags rolled like each of the missing dudes had just stepped out for a piss. Their food was still there, their phones left behind with batteries completely drained, and it was like the two of them had been lifted straight out of their bags by a goddamn UFO or something. Now, Rob's story never changed. He gave the same details every time the detectives talked to him. He woke up alone, hadn't heard anything the night before. No arguing, no fighting, just poof, and they were gone. Now, way weirder stuff has happened to me, search and rescue and military, that I can't directly point to as weird, but this one had something about it, and not in a good way. It's not the setup that really bothers me. It's how Rob acted once we got him out of there. I've seen men after they'd taken a life. Not in the Hollywood, hell yeah, brother, we got him kind of way, and not in that dumb, oh God, what have I done kind of way either. That's total fakery too. It's something quiet, kind of intangible and unmistakably heavy all at once. And it's like it sits on a person and hangs over them like a dark cloud you can see long before you take a look into their eyes. There's that seen too much look in the eyes, a voice that's just a little too steady, and then these rehearsed answers a person falls back on because they don't want to think about what they just did. And Rob had that exact way about him. He sat on that rock, arms were folded, describing how his two best friends had vanished into thin air, and there wasn't a single crack in the delivery. No tears, no I should have done something, just the facts, like he'd practiced reeling them off. I mentioned it to the lead detective later and told him the only time that I'd seen a man act like that was after he'd done something permanent to another human being, like what was done, and he was already living with the psychological consequences. The guy nodded and said that he'd look into it, and for a while there, I hoped that there was something to it and I wasn't just being paranoid. But Rob had a clean background, no history of violence, and there certainly hadn't been any insurance policies taken out on the two missing guys. Now, what with them being fairly young and fitter and healthier than the average. And on top of that, they found no blood, no signs of any struggle, nothing like that, and it really was like the two guys just vanished from the face of the earth. Eventually, the search scaled back, and officially speaking, Mark and Ben are still missing. But unofficially, I don't think anything but their remains are going to be found, and probably not anytime soon either. Rob walked out of the hospital the next day. He gave a couple of statements, thanked us for finding them, and then that was that. The world just moved on like there was nothing at all wrong with Rob's supposed lack of knowledge. Last I heard, he moved out of state, and it seems crazy, but he was never charged with a single thing. No bodies, no evidence, just a story that didn't add up, and a demeanor that, if you knew what you were looking for, stank to high heaven. Crazy things happen in the woods, I know that all too well, but two grown men don't just evaporate in the middle of the night, and a guy who supposedly spent a day and night alone, terrified his friends are hurt or dead, doesn't sit on a rock looking like he's already made peace with whatever happened. I've pulled people out of way worse situations who still had fight left in them. Some of them even demanded to help search for their friends, but there was Rob, looking like he'd already checked out. And above all the other things, I remember that look in his eyes, that calm, like the hard part was already over. I used to volunteer with Seattle Mountain Rescue back in the 80s, and my HQ was up in the Cascade foothills outside of some little logging town in Washington. I was mostly volunteers back then, with a team made up of a bunch of us who knew the woods from hunting, fishing, or just living out that way. I was in my late 20s at the time and worked construction during the week, but when a call came in for a missing kid, we dropped everything and came running to the rescue. In my 5 years volunteering, I worked more than 300 SNR operations in total, and every single one of them is memorable. Most are memorable because we found our missing people, brought them home, and saved the day. But some are memorable for all the wrong reasons, like this one I'm about to tell you about right now. The girl's name was Lisa. She was 14 years old when she went missing, and she was last seen walking home from school on a Tuesday afternoon. Her usual route took her down about 3 miles of gravel road and then a stretch of trail that cut through the trees to her folks' place. Then, since it's not often someone gets lost on an open stretch of road, gravel or no gravel, we mustered up on the trailhead around dusk. Now, the sun was going down early that time of year as it was October, so we moved as fast as we could, mostly with just the standard stuff at first, like grid searches, looking for footprints, or anything that she might have dropped, along with the really old school stuff like just calling out her name. We had a little daylight to work with at first, but it wasn't long before it was full dark and no stars. About an hour in, fog was starting to settle in these low spots. I was on the ground team with 3 other guys, and we'd been out maybe 2 hours when I first noticed him. Now, at first, he was just this figure off to the side of the search line, standing in the trees maybe 80 yards out. He had a dark coat, dark pants, and a baseball cap on, and he was just sort of standing there, watching us. I shone my flashlight that way, and he stepped back into the shadows like he didn't want to be seen. And while that might ring alarm bells for a lot of you, it's actually not all that rare. You sometimes get locals who hear about a search and they'll drive over to start rubbernecking. Some do it out of malice, convinced that we're not doing our jobs right. Others do it just because they're curious and even try to volunteer sometimes. But this guy, he stayed way back. I called over to the team leader on the radio and said that there was some dude watching us. He radioed back to keep an eye on him, but otherwise stay on task. Now, as always, the missing kid came first. We kept on working and moving from place to place, but every time we'd shift the line or circle back toward the road, there he'd be again, still tracking parallel to us. Not helping, not calling out the girl's name, just watching us, all quiet. Now once, when we stopped to rest and pass around the thermos of coffee, I saw him closer, maybe 40 yards that time. His face looked strange under that cap, and I'm not trying to make out that I saw it coming or anything, but he sure did give me the creeps the time that I saw him closer. One of the older guys, Pete, muttered something about damn ghoul journalists, and we all laughed a little, in the way you do when you just shake it off. It hadn't occurred to me that he might have been a local journalist who wanted to write a story on the girl's disappearance. But as it turned out, Pete was wrong on that one. Dead wrong. By midnight, the ground search was winding down for the night, and we'd still found no sign of her. We set up a base camp near the trailhead with generators and lights and tried not to put all of our hope into the aerial unit, which was supposed to come in at first light if the weather held. Now, I remember I was on overnight watch rotation, just keeping the radios hot and the coffee going, and then around 2 in the morning, I stepped out to take a leak, and there he was again. He was further down the road this time, standing by the tree line under a streetlight that barely cut through the fog, and once again it looked like he was just observing us. I was tired and in no mood for him by then, and so I yelled out, asking if he needed something in that sort of passive-aggressive, loud kind of way. I thought he might try to explain himself, especially if he was a reporter or something, but he just turned and walked off into the dark without a word. I told the deputy on scene, and he said that he'd keep an eye out, but we both knew resources were thin. Morning came, and since the weather held, Ariel went up at around 7. They were doing expanded circles, looking for stuff like clothing or movement or disturbed ground. Then about an hour in, the pilot radioed that they'd spotted a man walking a ridge about 2 miles east of the search area, one with almost the exact same description to the guy who'd been shadowing our search. Dark coat, dark pants, baseball cap. They tracked him for a while from the air, and he looked at them a bunch of times to show that same pale face as he walked through the brush. Ariel then said that he reached a gravel road, turned down it, and then walked until we reached some isolated property a few miles down. The crew said it was this old 2-story place with peeling paint and no neighbors for at least half a mile, and then after watching him go inside, he hadn't come out again. Now, that was enough for the sheriff's office to get a warrant signed by a judge, and then as soon as the paperwork came through, they dispatched 2 of their deputies to go check it out. I was still at the command post when the call came over the radio that they were at the house, and from what I heard later, and from the after-action talk as well, the guy who answered the door seemed perfectly calm and perfectly reasonable. They asked why he'd been shadowing the search, and he gave some, once again, acceptable answer about having heard that there was a missing girl and wanting to help. The deputies asked why he'd acted so skittish, such as walking off into the dark when I called out to him, but he said he just didn't want to get in the way. I heard that both deputies figured that it was probably a false alarm, but seeing as safe is always better than sorry, they asked if they could take a look inside, and the guy said sure. The deputies followed him into his kitchen, said the place was kind of cluttered too, dirty dishes, old stacks of newspapers, empty cans of ham that would have had flies buzzing around them in the summertime. One deputy was talking to him, the other was looking around, and then out of the blue, the guy just moved. He lunged for a drawer, pulled out a pistol, and then opened fire on each of the deputies from point blank. The first shot hit one deputy in the shoulder and spun him around like a top. The other deputy threw himself back to avoid the guy's shots, then drew and returned fire. I heard at least 4 of the deputies' 5 shots rip through our guy, sending him back against some cabinets with a crash and then down onto the floor with some big thud. And with his wounded coworker lying on the kitchen floor, the deputy that shot the guy went about clearing the house before he called for backup and medical. And he then went about treating the wounded man's injuries, and then there was something he noticed during that clearance. The basement door was locked from the outside with a padlock, and when the cops came to open it, they heard something faint coming downstairs, something like metal on metal. They forced the door, went down into the dark with their flashlights, and that's where they found her. Lisa, the girl we've been looking for, chained by the ankle to a pipe in the corner of this unfinished cellar. The guy had turned it into a prison cell. Concrete floor, bare bulb that barely worked, mattress that looked like it had been down there a long time. She was alive, thank God, but was scared out of her mind, and I heard she didn't start really calming down again until her mom and dad arrived at that staging area to come get her. She was half-starved and severely dehydrated, but by some miracle, she hadn't been, well, let's just say she was intact enough that the doctors said that she'd recover physically. Mentally, I don't know how any young woman could get over something like that, but time heals all wounds, I suppose. We never got the full details on exactly how long he'd had her or what he had planned. The house had no other kids' clothes or toys, just tools and that chain that looked like it came off of a logging site. But whatever he had planned, thank God we got to him before he put it into action, you know? I didn't see the inside of the house myself. SAR doesn't do that once it turns criminal. But I heard the radio traffic and saw the ambulance leave with Lisa and the wounded deputy. And then later that day, when the debrief came around, there was a huge pile-in because everyone wanted to know what the heck the cops found up there. The guy they shot had no record to speak of. He was apparently just a quiet, lonely guy who worked odd jobs and lived out there alone. Neighbors said that he kept to himself and that he sometimes walked the woods at odd hours, and no one had any idea why he liked doing that, but I guess the whole incident with Lisa let people know that there had been a sort of quiet monster living among them. If Ariel hadn't spotted him heading home that morning, well, I don't like to think about it. Another day or two, and who knows, maybe we would have found her body. Lisa's poor family moved away not long after, and then, from what I heard, the house was boarded up and torn down years later. People ask if it changed how I see people, and if I'm being honest, it made it harder to trust strangers, and I keep people at arm's length until I really know them, because sometimes you never really know someone until it's far too late.
Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember...
Joel's gay.
No. No, I'm not. Okay, bye-bye.
So I guess the wildest thing I've ever experienced happened last year, and I still don't know how to explain it without sounding like I'm making it up. You see, it started with these little things going missing. I live alone in a pretty quiet neighborhood, so I figured that I was just being forgetful. A protein bar here, a sock there, whatever. And then my TV would be on a different input than I left it. Nothing huge, just enough to make me second-guess myself. The weirdest part, I'd hear these faint bumps in the ceiling sometimes, and I'd chalk it up to raccoons or something. My house is old, stuff creaks, but then one night, I came home late from work and I could swear that I saw a shadow move past the vent opening in the hallway ceiling. I told myself I was tired, imagination, but I couldn't shake that feeling. So I set up one of those cheap motion sensor cameras that I bought off Amazon, pointed it straight at the attic access panel in the hallway. 2 nights later, I get a notification at 2:17 a.m. Motion detected. I opened the clip, and my stomach dropped. There was a person climbing down from the attic, like full-on, quietly stepping down the ladder, looking around, and heading into my kitchen. I froze. I was in the house at the time that clip was taken. I called the cops immediately, locked myself in my room with a bat, freaking out while they did a full sweep. They found no one at first, but when they checked the attic, there was a little setup up there. A sleeping bag, some snacks, a small camping stove, empty water bottles. Someone had clearly been living up there. The person was my neighbor's grown son, who apparently had some drug issues and got kicked out a while back. He broke in when I was on vacation a few months earlier and just never left. He'd sneak down at night to grab some food or watch TV. He got arrested, and I moved out 3 weeks later. I still have trouble sleeping in total silence because now every creak makes me think someone's crawling around above me. It was mid-March. My friends and I were in our early 20s and really into backpacking, hiking, camping, etc. Living in the Pacific Northwest, we were definitely in the right area to satiate our cravings for the outdoors. We wanted to go on a weekend camping trip, so earlier in the week, we went out scouting for an area to camp. After we drove a ways out of town, we found a rural road that looked pretty promising. A few miles down the road, we came to an intersection. We could continue straight where the paved road turned to gravel, turn left to be near a creek about 20 feet from the road, or turn right onto what looked like a little used, mostly grass-covered road. We decided to turn right and see what the area held. The grassy road followed a gentle left curve for about 100 yards and then opened up to a small roundabout with a flat, campground-looking area to the right of it. The site looked like it had been used plenty of times, but there was a lot of untouched grass on the road and a flat area, so we assumed no one had been there in a while. We liked the spot, but it was a little close to the road for us, so we decided to get out and have a look around. Shortly into our inspection, we found a trail that went deeper into the woods. We hiked up it for a quarter mile or so and really liked the way it looked. It was rural enough that we could really feel like we were in the outdoors, and there was no pesky cell reception to distract us from Mother Nature. After deciding this would be our spot for the upcoming weekend, we packed up and headed home. Once we got back to cell service, one of us used Google Maps to make sure our prospective campsite wasn't on anyone's property. To our relief, we were in the clear for several miles around the area. We decided that since we were able to get Friday off work, We would pack up Thursday after getting home and head out that night to squeeze the most out of our trip. Fast forward to Thursday night. All of our gear was packed and we had all the food, water, and illicit substances we would need for 3 days of unwinding in the woods. As we pulled up the familiar grassy road and came around the bend, we saw the reflection of our headlights glaring back at us from the darkness, like the eyes of a large demon, angry that we'd intruded on its slumber. It was the taillights of a parked car. Our hearts collectively dropped as we slowed to a stop and decided what to do. We could hear a dog barking and saw a tent set up near the car, so we decided to turn tail and head home in defeat. After regrouping at home, we decided that if we tried again the following night, it would be enough time that hopefully whoever was there would have packed up and left. Fast forward to Friday night, we pulled up and the car was still there, along with the tent and the barking dog. Big letdown for sure, but after a brief talk amongst ourselves, we decided to risk it and stay. We parked on the roundabout about 50 feet away from the car and tent and hiked up the trail so we could be away from whoever was already there. We got out and the dog's barking reached a feral crescendo. Based on the fact that it hadn't already come over and started mauling us, we assumed it was leashed up or something. We quickly put on our packs and hiked up the trail in the dark with our flashlights on. It was a creepy walk, especially since everyone was practically holding their breath in fear of someone coming out to yell at us for trespassing or ruining their night or something, but nothing happened. After making it to a good spot and setting up camp, we got right to partying. We joked about what the camper or campers we passed must be thinking or doing right now and tried to scare each other with half-cocked theories about whoever it was and what they might do to take revenge on us for barging in on their quiet evening. Little did we know, the memory of our trip would be ruined in a way that none of us could have guessed. Eventually, we all fell asleep and the next day rolled around. I spent that Saturday hiking further up the trail and exploring. Nothing major happened and we ended the night much the same way that we did the previous one. Sunday is when the story takes a turn. Everyone was tired, hungover, and pretty much ready to go back to civilization, so we started hiking back to the car. When we got there, we all noticed a complete shift in the atmosphere. I can only describe the scene as eerie. It felt like all the life had been sucked out of the wilderness. For the first time since arriving, the woods were completely silent. The car was still there and so was the tent, but we didn't hear the dog barking anymore. Being daylight now, we could see more of the encampment. It was unusual to say the least. The car was up on the type of little ramps people use for working on their vehicles. The tent was open, and there was a plastic fold-up picnic table set up next to the car with all kinds of things on it. Motor oil, transmission fluid, automotive tools, a gallon of milk with the lid off, paper plates, miscellaneous food items, etc. And it looked like someone was working on their car in the middle of the woods and stopped to prepare a meal, only to seemingly vanish into thin air. Curiosity took over better judgment, and we decided to have a look. Walking cautiously through the campsite, we looked for any clues about why the person or people could have left in such a hurry, and my mind immediately went to the missing 411 cases. One of my friends pointed out that the windows of the vehicle were heavily fogged up, so we tried our best to peer inside. The windows were also pretty heavily tinted, so looking through them proved difficult, but the fog hadn't quite reached the edges of the glass. This made it possible to just barely see the silhouette of a large dog in the back seat. It sat there upright and panting hard, but not moving or making any other noise. And my heart sank. It was Sunday morning, and for all I knew, that dog had been trapped in this car since Thursday night when we first arrived. I assumed that's why it wasn't barking anymore. It probably didn't even have the energy and was likely badly dehydrated. We debated what to do and decided trying to break a window or open a door to let the dog out was a bad idea, since it could be violent or hurt itself on the broken glass trying to get out itself. We didn't have cell reception. We decided with heavy hearts that the best choice would be to drive back to town and call animal control as soon as we had service. We left and I made the call and did my best to explain the situation to the person who answered. He told me he would head out to the area in a few hours and update me on how it went, and I thanked him, and that was the end of the call. I waited around for hours to hear back from the guy, and I started getting restless. Worried for the well-being of the dog, I ended up calling him back when it reached around 7 p.m. He said he tried to follow my instructions, but to my dismay, he mistakenly continued straight down the gravel road for several miles rather than turning right onto the grassy road. He had actually just gotten back to cell phone service when I called. He told me that he would head back there the next day and try again, as it was getting late and he had other calls that he had to get to. And I was distraught. I started debating heading out there myself to let the dog out of that vehicle, but ultimately decided it would be best to let the professionals handle it. I had no idea how good that decision was at the time. The next day I heard nothing back from the animal control guy despite several calls from me, and by about 7 p.m. I was really frustrated, desperately hoping for the best, but ultimately fearing the worst. That's when one of my friends, who had been silently browsing her phone for a while, suddenly gasped. When we asked what was wrong, she started reading aloud from her phone, and it was a news story from a city about 4 hours away from ours. To this day, I have no idea how or why they were able to report this news so quickly, and the story roughly went as follows. On Redacted Road, the same one we went down to camp, in the town of Redacted, animal control was called about a dog trapped in the vehicle for several days. When they arrived on the scene, they tried the door of the vehicle, which was locked. The animal control employee called the local deputies, and a state patrol officer who was in the area showed up to assist. Upon shining his flashlight through the tinted window of the vehicle, the state patrol officer was able to identify the body of a woman in the back seat, accompanied by the dog in question. When the local deputies arrived, they were able to open the vehicle and help animal control capture the dog, a pit bull who was very aggressive upon the door being opened. The woman, identified as Redacted, was deceased. Cause of death at this time is unknown. We all sat in silence for about, I kid you not, maybe 10 seconds, and then my phone rang, showing a private number. I answered, and a female voice said, "Hello, this is Detective Redacted. Is this Mr. Redacted?" To which I answered by saying, "Yes, may I ask what this is about?" Or something along those lines, and she asked if I was the person who called in the dog trapped in the car, and I told her that I was. She asked me to explain what had happened, and I told her everything from the Thursday night we went up there until our present phone call, minus the bit about us just having to read the news story. Something in my gut told me that it would be better not to mention what we had just learned, and she seemed surprised and said, "Oh, that's it?" To which I replied, yes, that was all. And as an afterthought, I asked how the dog was doing, and she said it was alive and in the hands of animal control. And I then asked if she needed anything else from me, and she said no, but that I would hear from her if anything else came up. The call ended, and we all started talking at once, asking each other if anyone had touched the vehicle or anything at the campsite, and to our relief, it appeared none of us had. We couldn't help but imagine what would happen had we broken a window to rescue that poor dog. The next day I called the animal control guy and introduced myself and apologized for his experiences after explaining that we saw a news story about what we had found. I asked him what would become of the dog, and he told me it was going to the Humane Society and that they were going to try to rehabilitate it. Apparently it had been trapped in that vehicle so long that it started eating the person who was in there with it. I asked if I could come visit the dog, and he said that right now the dog was technically evidence related to the case and that I couldn't see it, but he would let me know if anything changed. Eventually we got word about the coroner's report. The woman was transient, a mother with an ex-husband and a 9-year-old son. She died from a drug overdose. Time of death was recorded to have happened at approximately midnight of the very same Thursday that we first went to the campsite and saw her car. After all this time, I googled the old news story about what had happened just to refresh my memory on the details, and what I found really took me by surprise. According to several other news stories that came up in my search results, stretching back to at least as early as 16 years before our event took place and up until the current year of 2025, there had been a surprising number of mysterious deaths that occur on that specific road that we found. We haven't been back to that neck of the woods since, and probably never will. This happened about a year or so ago, but I just read something fairly familiar and it reminds me of how it still gives me the chills. I have 3 kids who are around 9, 7, and 2 at the time, and also living with my husband. We live fairly rural in the UK, just on the outside of a small village. Every night I always check the door is locked and sometimes even the chain put across as well. This night, I was woken up very abruptly by a harsh banging on the front door. At first I thought that it was just someone drunk, thinking it was their house, but then they started trying to turn the handle. My husband wasn't near the door and I stood on the stairs with my phone in case I needed to call someone. My husband told the man he had kids in the house who were sleeping and to go away right now. The man started rambling and slightly slurring his speech. It wasn't extreme slurring, but his voice wasn't quite right. It seemed clear that he was either on something or mentally unwell. He kept asking for a certain woman by name, and my husband told him that there was no one by that name here and to go away. And the man kept insisting that we were hiding her and said he was coming in. During this time, there were a lot of strange sounds coming from behind the door. Thumping, scratching, and another sound that I couldn't quite place. My husband then told him that I had called the police. He gave a few more frantic thumps and then, I assume, left because we heard nothing else. We didn't hear anything like him attempting this with the neighbors either. And for a few hours I waited in case he came back. I had a tennis racket that I would have used if I had to, and luckily it didn't come to that. In the morning, since it was a weekend, I decided to go check outside, and honestly, I felt a little ill. There was a massive dent in the door, which I thought surely couldn't have been caused by a fist alone. Then, on the door and the panels near it, were fingernail marks and blood. It was enough that it needed to be washed off. Between the door and where the bins are, there was a smashed ashtray, also with blood on it in lots of pieces. One of the outdoor plants had been tipped over with the plant and soil all over the ground. My best guess is he tried to smash the door with the ashtray and cut himself, but that's just speculation. And my blood ran cold thinking about how clearly aggressive this man was, and we have absolutely no reason to be targeted. We told our neighbors, who were absolutely horrified, and they said they thought they heard something but just assumed it was a drunk. When we mentioned the woman's name, the neighbor says, "Oh God, that's," said her name. "She used to live where you do, a few doors down." She used to be into drugs and had a few shady people around, and the neighbor reckons maybe one of her old drug-using companions was searching for her. And even now, there have been a few incidents at her house where the police have been called, but I'm not sure what for. Now we have a video doorbell and alarms fitted, so at least a button now goes straight to a security system that, if you don't answer, will send the authorities. It didn't end in danger, but it so easily could have, and that's what's scary as hell. So seriously, she doesn't live here, and to the absolutely insane door-knocking guy, please, never come again. This happened a few years ago, and I never told anyone about it. I don't know why I'm posting it here now, but it's been on my mind again, and I just need to get it out. At the time, I lived pretty far out in the country, just me and my dog, no close neighbors, and it was usually really quiet, and I liked it that way. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night to the motion sensor light going off outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, but when I looked out the window, I saw a man standing at the end of my driveway. He wasn't moving, just standing there facing my home. I don't know why, but I froze. I just stood there staring at him and he didn't move at all. The lights went off after a while and everything went back to dark and quiet, and I didn't sleep much after that. The next night, it happened again. The light came on and there he was. Same spot, same stillness, just standing there staring at my home. By this point, I was starting to get really freaked out, so I called the sheriff's department, and they sent someone to check it out, but by the time they got there, this guy was already gone. The deputy told me that it was probably just some drunk guy or someone passing through, and that I shouldn't worry unless he started coming closer. But that didn't make me feel any better, but I tried to move on. This went on for about a week. Every night, like clockwork, I'd wake up and see him standing there at the end of the driveway. And it was always the same. He never moved, never said anything, just stood there staring at my house, and it got to the point where I started closing the blinds at night, but I still felt like I could feel him out there. And then, just like that, it stopped. I never saw him again after that week, with no explanation, no reason, it just ended. I've never told anyone about this before, it's probably not that big a deal, but it's something that's obviously stuck with me. I guess I just needed to write it down. Even though this happened almost 10 years ago, I've never been able to get it out of my head, so I thought I'd post here. I was about 11 or 12 years old, living in an apartment with my mom. Right across from my apartment was a very creepy neighbor. I could write a whole book about all the creepy, wild, and downright insane things he said and did during the 2 years he was our neighbor, but this is the one thing that stuck with me more than anything else. My mom and this neighbor were having a casual conversation. Her goal was to try to find some common ground with him and clear up any misunderstandings or miscommunications that may have led to him disliking us so much. He had a pretty blatant feeling of disdain towards us, I guess. But evidently, something went wrong during the conversation because my mom suddenly came stomping into our apartment, loudly shutting the door and locking it. She was visibly upset and shaken, so I asked her what was wrong. Her voice was trembling, and she said the neighbor had said this, completely unprompted. "You know, if I were you, I'd keep your daughter away from guys like me." Now, while I'll never know exactly what he meant by that, my mind definitely had plenty of ideas as to what that meant. At the very least, it felt like a thinly veiled threat, and the worst part was that I was often home alone, since I did online school when my mom was at work. And from that point on, I never felt safe being home alone. My imagination ran wild thinking about what he might end up doing to me while I was home alone. Now, I never thought that I'd say something like this, and I feel a little guilty about it, but thankfully, he ended up dying before he ever followed through on his creepy comment. Now also, before anyone asked, my mom only told me what he said because she wanted to warn me to stay away from him and to never, ever leave the door unlocked. This is a completely true story, and it happened just an hour ago, and I wanted to talk about it somewhere. Now, for context, my wife and I were on vacation in Mexico. We're both honestly loving it here, and the situation doesn't change that, but I am reevaluating security. My wife and I went out to dinner and walked back to our hotel. We got inside our room, we're setting things down and all that, and a few minutes go by and there's a knock at the door. A man quietly says something in Spanish, in an inflection that's clearly trying to get our attention. Think room service or something. My wife looks at me, wondering who would be at the door. And at this point, I should clarify that we had the Do Not Disturb tag on the door. A few seconds go by and there's a knock. My wife signals for me to go to the door, so I go over. At this point, we've made no sounds for probably a minute before and during the knocks. And just as I reach the door, the key card unlocks it, and it opens. A dirty-looking man is standing there, about 2 feet from my face. I put my hand on the door to prevent it from opening any further, and I think he was as surprised as I was. He starts speaking in Spanish, and I hear the word Wi-Fi somewhere in there, and I say, "No hablo español." In broken English, he tries to ask if the Wi-Fi is down. My wife says it's not. I'm just kind of shell-shocked by what just happened, and I keep my hand on the door as he talks and eventually leaves. I shut the door and engage the physical lock this time. I usually do this, but we had just walked in and were setting our stuff down. I talk with my wife as we try to gather our thoughts about what had just happened. Essentially, a man knocked, got no reply, and then let himself in and asked about our Wi-Fi. No, this was a clear burglary attempt. He had a master key card and thought that we weren't home. A minute or two after this went down, once we collected ourselves and understood what just occurred, I passed the information to the front desk in case this guy attempts other doors. They seemed to take it pretty seriously, but there were no updates beyond that. The fact that this just happened has my mind kind of blown, and I don't know if I've fully processed it yet. Like, what if we were back 30 minutes later? Probably would have lost some stuff. 5 minutes later, we walk in on a guy in our hotel room. What if we'd gone to bed earlier tonight? We could have been asleep. The AC is loud, and I don't know if I would have heard the knocking through my sleep. If it was going to go down, surely the way it did was optimal, but those ifs are crazy. I'll definitely be storing our valuables in the safe now. Should have done that already, but we just recently got here. Lesson learned, I guess. In the future, stuff is going immediately into the safe and the lock is getting engaged right away. It was just past midnight and my wife and I were in bed. She was asleep and I was watching TV trying to fall asleep. All of a sudden I heard a loud thud at the back door. Our master bedroom is at the front of the house. Then I heard a bunch of bumps all along the walkway on the side of the house, and meanwhile, the dog was losing his mind. There was pounding at the front door. I thought it might be the cops or some kind of emergency, so I jumped out of bed and turned to the corner to the front door, only to see a girl, probably in her 20s, very small, yelling, let me in, 4 men in a van, they're hunting me." And I'm just responding, what the F is going on, as she's pounding on the front door. I looked around and didn't see anyone. I told her as much, but then my wife rounded the corner and said to let her in. The girl ran in with no shoes on, wearing muddied pajama pants. I told her to sit down and said that I'd check things out. As I was putting on pants, she starts yelling, "They're right here, 4 men. They want to murder me. There's one aiming at me. They want to kill me." But there was no one. She started running around our house, jumped on our bed and slammed our window shut, and then ran into the guest room, then the bathtub, and then the laundry room. At that point, I was losing my patience, so I told her, "Go to the couch and sit down. There's no one out there. If you live 2 blocks away, I'll drive you." And that was a big mistake. At this point, I realized that she was unhinged and probably experiencing some kind of neurological episode. I just wanted her out of the house, so I got the car while my wife brought her outside. I checked the mirrors, totally empty streets. The girl started saying that they were crawling on my car, and I assured her that they weren't and asked for her address. 16th Avenue and 15th Street, she said. I told her that didn't exist in this neighborhood. She screamed and said they were coming. We hadn't even left yet. I told her again no one was out there. I asked her for directions if it was close, and I followed the rough 2 blocks that way she mentioned earlier. She started spitting out wrong addresses, and everywhere she said it should be, it wasn't. And then she covered it up by saying that she was just trying to lose them, crawling around the back seat and checking out the windows. "They're chasing us on scooters. I can see the gun," she yelled. And she shouted, "Go left, right, left." And of course, no one was there. I hit the brakes, and I turned to her and said, "Sit your butt down and put on a seatbelt." And she protested, so I said that I wasn't driving until she did. And then she pointed to a really nice house and said, "That one's mine." And it occurred to me, maybe I was the one in danger. Maybe she was directing me somewhere to get jumped, so I told her, "I'm not driving you anymore. Where do you actually live, and where can I drop you off?" And she said 7-Eleven, so that's where I went. It was just a couple of doors down from my house, and I told her to stay there and called the cops. I ran back home to see if we had any old shoes that she could take, and I assumed that she had taken some kind of weird drug. 5 cop cars ended up combing the neighborhood for a while, and it was obviously her who had made all that ruckus. I hope she got herself figured out, but I left that to the cops. So this happened last night. Around 3 a.m., my brother and I were woken up by loud banging and crying at our front door. We live in a rough neighborhood, so naturally my brother grabbed his shotgun, cocked it loudly, and started yelling, "It's 3 a.m., go away," through the door. We were both tired as hell and freaked out. We'd recently had a girl from the neighborhood break into my car, so we assumed it might actually be her. I looked through the front door's window. We've got a one-way film on it, and didn't see anyone else around. I crouched near the door and listened. It sounded like a young kid, completely hysterical, begging us to help her call her mom. I told her I was calling 911 and that help was on the way. My brother, in full adrenaline mode, opened the door, still holding his shotgun, and started yelling at her to calm down. I didn't agree with his approach, but in all fairness, she had woken up about half the blocks with her screaming while she pressed up against our door. After he opened the door, I got to see her. Honestly, I was kind of hoping it was a homeless person from our area or even someone looking to do some weird stuff to us. But it was a kid. And the look in her eyes while she was kneeling at our doorstep made my heart drop. I was thinking that she was around 14, but she said someone had crashed into her car down the street, and she left her phone in the wreck so she couldn't call her mom. Things weren't really adding up as I asked her a few more questions. She kept begging me to go down the street with her, but I told her no way. We're waiting for the cops. About 10 minutes later, 3 tow trucks drove by heading toward where we told 911 the crash happened, so I felt safe enough to walk with her down the street. On the way, she kept asking to hold my hand, and I'm just thinking, you look like a teenager, you're barely dressed, and I'm a grown man walking through a neighborhood you just woke up. Not a good look. And I awkwardly asked how old she was. She said 18 and grabbed my hand anyway. I felt very uncomfortable, but her emotions were definitely outweighing mine at that time. And halfway there, the cops showed up. I flagged them down and explained the situation. Meanwhile, she kept telling the officers over and over that I have really bad ADHD and anxiety, while handing me her eyelashes. A full set of false lashes. I really didn't want to touch them, but I took them just to help her feel a little safer or whatever. And one of the cops pulled her aside and the others started casually asking me a few questions. He told me they got another call about 30 minutes earlier that a teenager had been running across someone's lawn barefoot, which, when I looked over, realized that she had been barefoot the whole time. Then I saw them cuff her. I think they suspected she was on something, which I myself thought as well. As we were wrapping up, the officer saw me still holding the eyelashes and goes, "What are you going to do with those, bro?" And I just told him I'll sleep on it. I just want to go back to bed. I headed home and started talking to one of the neighbors about it, and he assumed it was her parents' house or something, so he didn't want to get involved in domestic drama. Makes sense, and I just assumed that's why no one else got involved. I couldn't really go back to sleep because I was shaken up and pretty annoyed about her, and I imagined it was a traumatic experience for her. I don't know if this was a justified reaction for her situation, or if she really was on drugs or mentally ill, but I would definitely be praying for her and her family. I was 22 years old when this happened. I worked in a grocery store which had been featured in the news, and you could see me in the clip, and it was clear where I worked. I just came back from vacation, and a coworker told me that some guy had been coming around every day for a week asking for me. When I asked who or why they told me, they had no idea, but he was around my age and seemed a little off. A few hours passed by, and my coworker came and told me that the guy was back and again asking for me. We'll just call this guy James. I can't even remember his name anyways. In the back room, we had a computer and you could see all the camera footage from all over the store. I looked and didn't recognize who James was, but decided to go ask what he wanted. And he was clearly drunk and said that he had seen me on TV and wanted to ask me out. I replied, "I'm sorry, but I'm in a relationship," even though I was single. I said that I needed to get back to work, and he asked me if he should come with me. I was confused and said that I am working, and he then left, but I could see him through the cameras outside the store drinking. A few hours had passed, and he was waiting for me outside, so I had to use another exit when I left. The next day I came to work and saw him waiting for me outside the store. He had this huge smile on his face and walked up to me. He was really shy and didn't say a word until I said hey while passing by to get into the store, and he followed me inside and said that he needed to talk. I asked him what's up, and he replies, "How about we go to the movies?" At this point I could tell that he was really creepy, and I replied, "I'm sorry, I have a boyfriend, remember?" As I was walking away, he started following me again and asked if he should come to help me with my work. "No thanks," I replied, once again. And I looked at the camera footage, and yet again he was waiting for me outside. And at this point I started asking my male coworker to escort me safely to the tram every night when my shift ended. I started getting really scared once this had been going on for a while, and he clearly wouldn't leave me alone. I asked my brother if he could drive me to work on his motorcycle and hug me outside my workplace so it looked like he was my boyfriend and James would maybe finally leave me alone. Since I knew he was somewhere watching and waiting for me to get to work, but that didn't seem to help. I started getting messages like, "Is that your boyfriend?" and "He doesn't need to know if we go out." And I was confused about how he had gotten my number. I asked all of my coworkers, and a new one said that she'd given my number because he said he was a friend of mine. And I was pissed. At this point, I asked my male coworker to throw him out if he ever came back, which was a lot to ask. And a couple of weeks went by without any harassment, and I finally thought that he had left me alone. But boy was I wrong. I came to work one day and was in the changing room and heard that we have a new coworker and it was his first day. I didn't think anything of it and proceeded to change my clothes. Once I got out of the changing room, my jaw dropped. Another coworker said, "Hey, this is James." And I looked in horror as she asked me what was wrong. I said, "I know. This is the creep that had been stalking me for weeks." As James started to smile, I went and searched for my boss to ask him what in God's name happened. My boss said that he had no idea that this was my stalker and kind of just laughed it off as no big deal. And I told him, either he leaves or I will. And he said that I wouldn't have to work the same shift as James and that he couldn't fire him right there. But he lied. I had a lot of shifts with him, and whenever I went, he would just follow me without saying a single word, and he would just continue to follow me. I would often have my lunch break by the computer so I could see where he was. And every day I could see him just staring at me, behind me as I ate, as we had a lot of cameras there also. And this went on for a while. He would text me every day, but at work he didn't say a thing, just sit there and stare. Now my boss finally understood what a freak James was and that he really didn't do any work either, just kind of stalking me, and started to think of ideas of how to get rid of him. And one time I noticed James was clearly drunk at work and I finally told my boss. And thankfully that day, he got fired. And this is when the stalking finally stopped. This begins when I was 15. I'm 18 now, and just for some background, I work in a 5-star Michelin restaurant as a waitress in a sweet little area. And we usually don't get anyone with bad intentions, usually just snobs. On Easter Sunday of 2022, one of the busiest days of the year, a man who will be known as the Easter Man came looking for a table for one. He was in a 3-piece suit, carrying a carton of chicken eggs. He was seated in my section, so I went over to get his drink and food order. And once I got his order, he kept talking, asking about my education, what I was doing in school, and what my plans were for the future, what my hobbies were, my name, etc., etc. It was just a little too much to be polite, but I let it slide. I was busy, tired, and I didn't want any trouble, and eventually he left for the day, and I thought that was that. And oh, was I wrong. For the next couple of months, he would come in 2 to 3 days every week. He got more confident, attempting to flirt with me, asked me to come out with him after work, etc. However, things just got worse during one shift. I was walking him to his table and he slid his hands down my back and over my butt. I turned around and somehow politely told him not to touch me and not to push my boundaries as I was only 15, and he knew that. And I didn't serve him that day. Now a week later, he comes in and I refused to serve him again. My manager took over his table, yet when everybody was on break and I was the only one on the floor, he came inside, and he knew by this point that it was table service only, and he came up behind me, bringing his hands down my arms. I was shaken up, but politely again told him not to touch me. And I didn't hear from him again until next Easter, 2023. Last Easter, things got worse. He showed up again with his usual shenanigans. However, my managers were prepared this year, not allowing me to go near him and keeping me safe, though this was only useful inside of work. I walked through the town center to get to work. It's about a 25-minute walk from the train station. As I was walking to work one day, he saw me from his car and followed me into work, and I immediately told my managers, who again told me to stay away from him. A week later, I was having coffee before work and about a 50-minute walk from my job. What do you know? Guess who sees me and follows me on foot to work? I told my managers again, who kept me away from him again. Yet that day was different. He asked my managers for me, saying he knew I was there because he'd seen me. Now last year, 2024, I took a lot of holidays around Easter time and was off for exams. Supposedly he came in a few times asking for me and didn't come in much when I wasn't anywhere to be seen. It's just truly terrifying that I have a stalker who shows up every Easter.
I work at a recently built city parking garage and transit hub. And late at night, it is my job to lock everything up until the morning and patrol the dark building alone with just a radio linked to the local police department. It's a very simple procedure that takes maybe 10 minutes to lock everything up. with 15-minute walkthroughs every hour. At roughly 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm very tired from my 8-hour shift with 4 more hours to go. I drag myself through the security center, fancy talk for a room with a chair and monitors, and begin my ascent through the ramps. I listen to my footsteps echo and realize it seems quieter than usual. I can smell the typical putrid smell of the city, of the fermenting feces in the trash can from the numerous homeless from around the area using the trash bins. We had to lock down the public bathrooms to prevent damage, theft, vandalism, and most importantly, deaths from people overdosing in there in the middle of the night. I finally got to the top floor and summoned the elevator. I placed my forehead against the door, feeling the cold air rush up through the elevator shaft as it reached my floor with a satisfying... I stepped, got to the ground floor, and continued back to the office. I fling the door open and I head inside, running for the cold office room and using my magnet fob to unlock the door. The door usually gets hung up a little, so with a swift heel, I slam it shut and I make my way to the desk. The computer that runs the cameras is worthy of being called ancient. I'm pretty sure that they don't even make them anymore. Not to mention the internet that the cameras run off of are so slow that it takes forever to update. And so I sat there with my new favorite pastime, watching myself walk around with a tremendous amount of lag time. And I sat there, watching myself drudge on through the stupidly hot weather. And I laugh at myself as I watch my head land against the cold steel on top floor elevator doors. As the doors open and the light floods the area around me, my blood went ice cold. There was a man standing no more than 6 feet away, just staring at me. And as I entered the elevator, he headed for the stairs, already vaulting down the steps. My heart races as I watch each camera as he hits each floor. I hit the 4th, the 3rd. Almost seamlessly, he keeps perfect time with the elevator. My ears begin to boil as I feel all the blood rush to my head. I'm having a hard time breathing. I watch as the elevator doors close and he begins following me again, getting closer and closer after each turn of the corner. I watch as I fling open the door and he catches it, heading in right behind me, my heart pounding in my eardrums. He's inside the building. I keep watching, knowing that I should look away. But I can't find him. And then I see why. I kicked the door shut in his face, which means... As I search the room, I eventually discover that it's just me in there. I radio for a few officers to come in, and they sweep the building, giving me a slap on the wrist for not paying attention, and left. The rest of the night, I stayed in that room. I watched each camera diligently, but never saw him again. Now every time I go to work, I can never shake the feeling that I'm being watched.
Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast. We can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon. About 20 years ago now, my wife and I decided that we need more room for our family, so we picked out a house for sale that was within our budget and then went through the process of purchasing it and moving in. Now to us, the house was perfect for ourselves and our 2 kids, named Lily and Max. They loved their new bedrooms, they loved the backyard and its outdoor pool, and it was actually western facing too, so we could sit out there and enjoy the sunset every night. And the neighborhood was quiet, with friendly people who waved if they passed while I was mowing the front lawn. And it felt like our own little slice of paradise, a place where nothing bad could really happen. We were happy, and I thought that we'd found our forever home. Now weeks and weeks went by and everything stayed great. The kids played in the yard while my wife got accustomed to the new kitchen, and I was as happy as all heck with the size of the new garage. We felt very safe, like pretty much nothing could touch us. But one night, everything changed. It was late and the house was dark. The kids were asleep, Emma was in bed reading, and I was about to lock the front doors when I heard a loud noise outside. It was sort of a soft thud, like something heavy hitting the door. I kept on listening for a minute or two, and then when I didn't hear anything else, I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a car's trunk slamming in the distance. I went over to the back of the house to lock the back doors, and that's when I heard the footsteps. They were heavy, and they were only getting louder, but before I could move, the door in front of me crashes open. After being thrown back, I saw the men rush in. They were wearing black with their faces hidden behind masks. They carried flashlights and bags, and one even had some type of blunt object like a crowbar. And my legs felt weak, but I couldn't run. I had to protect my family. And the second they saw me, they rushed forward. There were 4 of them, tall, very well built. They pushed me into the living room as my wife stood at the top of the stairs, looking pale and frightened. Lily and Max woke up and ran to join her, and I wanted to tell them to run, to hide, but my voice couldn't work. It was like a dream. The men ordered my wife and kids downstairs too, and they shoved us onto the couch. They then stood over us with those flashlights that were bright, blinding us, which I guess was kind of part of their plan. Finally, one of them stepped closer. He was the tallest, and his mask was black with holes for his eyes and mouth, and he leaned down so close that I could smell his stinking breath. He didn't speak, but his eyes were burned into mine. Another man, shorter with a red mask, started pacing back and forth. He kicked over some lamp and it shattered on the floor. The sound started to make Lily cry, and Emma pulled her closer. The tall one grabbed my shirt and pulled me to my feet. His flashlight was shining in my face, and I squinted trying to see. The others circled us. They were like wolves circling prey. The men wanted something specific, but I didn't have much, only enough to start our new life. But that didn't seem to deter them. They carried on, searching, tearing through drawers and shelves, throwing books and dishes to the floor. One of them, with a kind of greenish mask, found a picture of us at the beach. He stared at it, and then at me. His head was tilted, like he was confused. The tall one grabbed my arm again, harder this time. He shook me, and I stumbled. Emma screamed, and Max clung to her, his face buried in her side. I wanted to fight, to push them away, but there were too many, and they were too strong. The tall one dragged me to the kitchen. He threw me against the counter, and pain shot through my ribs as I slammed into it. The others brought Emma and the kids, forcing them to sit on the floor. Lily was sobbing now, and Max's eyes were huge, like he didn't understand what was happening. I didn't either, but I had to try and stay strong for them, no matter how hard that was. The men started ripping open cabinets, pulling out pots and pans. They weren't looking for food or money. They were looking for something else, something we didn't have, but they seemed damn sure that it was there. I remember how the short one in the greenish mask suddenly stopped and pulled one of our kitchen knives from the block that held it. Emma gasped, and I felt sick. The knife was long and sharp, and as he held it close to her face, my hands shook and my legs were feeling like jelly. The tall one grabbed me again, his fingers digging into my arm. He leaned close, and his mask was brushing my cheek, and I could hear his breathing, very fast and heavy. They wanted something that was hidden, but they didn't say what, and I didn't know what they meant. We had no gold, no jewels, no valuable secrets hidden anywhere. That was a brand new home, our new start. All the money we had in the world was in its foundations, not in the walls or the closets. I tried to think, to remember if we found anything strange in that house, but nothing could come to mind. Just boxes and paint cans and old furniture from the last owners. I told the men that much, but they didn't believe a word of what I'd said. The one with the knife stepped closer to Emma, and my world started to go dark. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't let them hurt her or the kids. The man in the green mask stopped again. He was looking at the picture, then at us. He grabbed the tall one's arm and pointed at me. They stepped back, their heads close together. I couldn't hear them, but they were arguing in whispers before one of them suddenly said, "Shut this up. It's not here." The tall one shook his head, but the green masked man kept pointing. He picked up another picture, one of us moving in, and stared at it. His shoulders were slumped, and he dropped the picture. The others froze, watching the two guys argue. Then suddenly they backed away. The tall one let go of me, and I fell to my knees. The man with the knife lowered it, stepping back. They looked at each other, and then at us, and then without a word, they turned and walked out no faster than they'd come in. The house was silent except for my daughter's sobs and my heavy breathing. Emma crawled over to me and we held the kids tight. My hands were shaking as I checked them for cuts and bruises, and everyone was okay. We were just terrified. I called the police. They came pretty quickly. Their lights were flashing through the windows as we went out to meet them. They searched the house and the yard and the street outside. They found footprints in the mud, but that was pretty much it. These men were gone. The police asked questions, wrote things down, and promised to look for them. But from what I told them, and I agreed with this, they said it was a mistake, that the men thought we were someone else. Maybe the last owners, maybe someone with some valuables hidden somewhere, but they didn't know who. The police never found the men, no one was arrested, and we fixed the broken lamp and cleaned up the mess. The house didn't feel like paradise anymore. Emma stopped humming all cheerfully in the kitchen, and the kids didn't really want to play outside anymore. We locked the doors, checked the windows, and slept with the lights on, and I started keeping a gun in the bedside drawer just in case. The neighborhood stayed very quiet, and nobody else was hurt, but I really couldn't shake the fear. Watching out the windows and the doors and that dark driveway out front, I wanted to protect my family, to make our home safe again in all the ways I'd failed the first time. But deep down, I knew that it would never feel the same. Paradise was gone, and all we had left were the memories and that endless fear. My name's Adam, and I'm from Leeds here in the UK. And a few years ago, myself and my parents and my sister moved into a new house not too far from our old one. It was a semi-detached place in a quiet street with a neat front gardens and old-fashioned street lamps. We had nice neighbors too, at least on one side anyway, who called over to introduce themselves with some cake and a cup of tea. But those were the neighbors in the houses surrounding us. The ones in the house attached to ours was very, very different. They didn't smile, they didn't wave, and they'd either ignore us if they saw us in the street or stare from their windows if they got the chance, with these very cold, unfriendly stares. Mum said to ignore them. Dad said that some people were just kind of like that, so rather than do anything silly to try and make them like us, we did our best to just ignore it and settle in and not let it bother us. Despite all that, the first couple of weeks were as normal as we could expect. I went to the same school, got used to playing football in the new garden, and helped Mum and Dad unpack boxes of garden furniture. Friends and family stopped over to check out the new house, and while they were mostly interested in the new place, they'd sometimes ask about the neighbors and what they were like. Mum used to say that they were quiet. Dad used to say that he'd met nicer people. And my parents never said anything overly bad about them, but people got the message. They weren't the friendliest of neighbors, and that was that. I sometimes used to wonder aloud why they were so unfriendly with us, but I never got an answer. Mum said that we should just leave them alone, and hopefully they'd just carry on leaving us alone too. But as it turned out, just living next door to them was a liability. One night I was up in my room playing a bit of FIFA when I heard these noises outside. It sounded like car doors slamming, footsteps on the path outside, and low voices. It sounded extremely suspicious, so I got up and peeked out my window to see what was going on. In the driveway of the house next door, I saw shadows moving in the dark. I couldn't see faces, just sort of hooded shapes moving around. Then seconds later, The shapes piled into a car and sped off. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe the neighbors just had some late visitors, and then I went back to playing video games. But not before leaving my window open, something I look back on as a kind of like fate at this point. I say that because maybe only a minute or two later, I started smelling something burning, and then I heard the shouts outside. I ran to the window and saw flames all over the front door of our attached neighbor. Not just inside either, outside too, with these bright orange and yellow flames making their driveway glow as smoke climbed into the air. I grabbed my phone and called 999. Then, when Dad heard me asking for the fire brigade, he came running to see what was happening. He took one look at the flames and then shouted at us to get out of the house. All of us ran outside right away, grabbing only what was essential before standing on the pavement in our socks or bare feet. It seemed like the whole neighborhood was gathered out there by then, watching from their driveways or the street outside their homes. Apparently, the neighbors that had been targeted weren't home. We knew because their car was gone. But just the thought of them being targeted like that was still deeply shocking to us. A few minutes later, the fire engines arrived and men in heavy gear jumped out before hosing down the flames. Everyone cheered when the firemen finally put out the fire, but the neighbor's house was still a mess. The firemen checked our house too, to make sure that there was no danger or risk or anything. They said the fire hadn't spread to our side, but the smell of smoke still clung to everything and made it so we couldn't just kind of carry on and try to forget. We went back inside, but I couldn't get to sleep for ages thanks to the adrenaline and that grim burn smell. The next day, some police stopped by to ask questions and take statements. I don't think they'd even finished before word got around to us. The fire wasn't some accident. It was a deliberate attack, just like we'd suspected. And that was the first time that I heard the word arson, and it wouldn't be the last. The only questions left were things like, who would do something like that and for what reason? And then, we heard about the other fire. Just a few nights before ours, a house on the other side of the city had burned in an almost identical arson attack, and it didn't take long before the police started to think that the two fires were somehow connected. Everyone reckoned that it must have been some kind of retaliation, and the fact that neighbors weren't home at the time made us think they probably knew that it was coming and probably knew who did it too. It probably explained why they were so standoffish with us too. If they had those kinds of beefs going with people, it was probably just their default setting to be wary and cautious of strangers. Maybe they knew they were putting ourselves at risk just by living next door to them and didn't want to get close because they knew that it'd further put us in harm's way. And the neighborhood was quiet for a while after that. As the one who saw the fire start, I couldn't help but feel jumpy at times. Every noise made me think of footsteps or car doors. Mom and Dad tried to act normal, but I saw them watching the street too, especially when the moving truck showed up and started helping the neighbors move out. In the weeks after, nothing else happened. There were no more fires, no more strange noises, and slowly but surely the neighborhood got back to normal as kids felt safe enough to play out in the street again. The neighbor's house stayed empty for a while with a for sale sign out in the front, and it stayed like that for ages as the grass grew tall in their garden. They were gone, but their house was a reminder, a dark, broken thing next to ours that took years before the estate agents found a buyer. I've never forgotten what happened and how that night could have been much, much different should that fire have spread any quicker. Many, many years ago now, when our son was barely out of diapers, me and my kid's mom moved into a real nice duplex out in the suburbs. It was on a quiet street, and the neighbors were quite friendly, and some even actually came over to help us unpack. Now, the guy in the home next door didn't show up, but when we heard that he was some elderly widower who didn't get around so easily anymore, we obviously gave him an instant pass. Now, our son Luke loved the big backyard and pool that we now had. He loved his new bedroom too, but what he didn't love was the big old closet with its sliding wooden doors. He seemed almost cautious of it right away. But then a few nights after we settled in, Luke started acting very strange about his new closet. At first, he said that he wanted to keep it open, so he could see that there were no monsters in there. But then later, he said that he wanted to sleep with it closed because someone was inside the closet and they would watch him whenever we left him alone. I thought that it was just the new house making him nervous, and that his big old imagination was just getting the better of him. And so that night, to help him feel safe, I started what became a regular bedtime routine. Every night I checked his closet for monsters, I opened the doors, rustled his clothes a little, and showed him how, aside from them, it was completely empty. I'd then shut the closet, tuck him into bed, and then maybe sit in the chair and read him a bedtime story until he fell asleep. It worked for him, and he slept like the dead from then on. But for me, that feeling of unease never entirely went away. Something about Luke's fear stuck in my mind, how sort of primal and authentic it actually seemed. His mom said it was probably nothing, just a father worrying too much about his over-imaginative son. But still, I kept checking the closet every night during our little routine, which I increasingly realized wasn't for him anymore, it was for me. Now, a little time went by, maybe 2 or 3 months, and I decided to give Luke's room a deep clean. The house was old, the kind of place where dust settled just about everywhere, so I vacuumed the carpet, wiped all the windows down, and cleaned under his bed too. And then once I was done, I moved to the closet. As I swept the floor, I noticed something against the back wall. It was a little pile of sawdust, maybe an inch or two tall, piled near the back wall. Since I didn't remember seeing sawdust when we moved in, I pushed Luke's clothes aside and looked closer. And then, in that dim light, I saw it, clear as day. A small hole in the wall near the floor, about the size of a coin. There wasn't any light coming through at the time, but it was there all right. I remember my heart rate going into overdrive as these dual feelings of disgust and anger rose up inside me. The hole looked like it went straight through, so I grabbed a flashlight and shined it inside, and that's how I figured out that there was some kind of cover on the other side, something to hide it when it wasn't in use. But I knew someone could see through it if they removed the cover. The wall was shared with the neighbor's house, that elderly widower who lived on the other side of that duplex. I thought about them moving away the paper or card or whatever it was and watching my boy as he slept, and my hands shook as I thought about that. My son hadn't been imagining things. Someone really had been watching him. And so I sat back, staring at that hole. My head was pounding as 1,000 different thoughts raced around in my mind all at once. We never saw that widower much. He was mostly just sort of shadows moving behind curtains, but the thought of him watching my son made me feel sick to my stomach, but not just sick, angry too. I wanted to scream, to run next door and demand answers before taking some well-deserved retribution. But I stopped myself. I knew how it would end. If I confronted him, I wouldn't stay calm and I'd end up in jail for sure. I could feel the anger building, the kind that didn't stop. I'd hurt someone, or worse, for Luke's sake. I couldn't let that happen. I decided that I didn't want that guy to know that I knew, if that made any sense. I wanted to try and actually catch him doing something, maybe on camera, so I had actual evidence of the crime. I went to the garage, found some wood filler and a putty knife, and then worked fast to fill it in and cover it over. I then checked the wall for other holes, and when I didn't find any, I moved Luke's clothes back and swept away the sawdust. The closet looked normal again, but I didn't feel any better. What kind of person drills a hole to watch a child, and how the hell was I going to catch him in the act? My hands clenched into angry fists every time I thought about it, and I only stopped feeling murderously angry after I spoke to Luke's mom about it. And that night, I checked his closet like I always did. My son didn't know about the hole, and there was no way in hell that I was about to tell him on an account of not wanting to scare him. So I tucked him in, turned off the light, and watched him fall asleep as usual. But unlike him, I couldn't relax. Even though the hole was gone, I kept imagining the widower's eyes on the other side of the wall. I imagined him kneeling down and moving away the cover and cursing as he realized someone had gotten wise to his plan. A part of me thought that I'd have him backing off for a while, but I also knew that if he did it once, he was probably going to do it again. I started checking the closet more, during the day too. I'd slid the doors open and stare at the wall, waiting for something to happen or to hear something moving on the other side, but I never saw or heard anything. and the stress of it started to affect my sleep. I started locking the windows and back door every night, and something I never did before. I told myself it was to keep my son safe, but the truth is, I was scared too. Luke's mom felt the same way. She was furious, but she also knew that it was better not to escalate, as any sort of confrontation might go very wrong and very fast. If this guy was willing to drill a hole in the wall to spy on our kid, what else was he willing to do? I never felt the same in that house afterwards, and I never felt the same about that supposedly sweet old widower either. I wanted to catch him doing something, anything to prove what I knew. I paid to have some security cameras installed, which were super expensive compared to those Ring doorbells you can buy these days, and I thought that it'd be worth the investment, but the guy next door never did anything on any cameras. His house stayed dark, with his curtains always closed. I thought about calling the police, purely just to warn them that I thought our neighbor was a creep. But not only had I removed what little evidence I had, I also wasn't sure how to phrase things to avoid sounding like some paranoid a-hole bullying his elderly neighbor. I felt like an idiot, and I still do, actually, but I kept quiet. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed, and I told myself it was just for home defense, but deep down, I knew I was ready to use it for home offense. If I heard someone in Luke's room, if I even so much as heard someone creeping around outside, I wouldn't hesitate. I even got excited about the idea of catching the guy, excited about the idea of smashing his head in, and that scared me almost as much as the hole. And after a couple of minutes went by and still nothing had happened, I started to relax a little. There had been no new holes, no strange noises. Luke hadn't talked about being watched in a while, and the only disturbed sleeps we got were when we'd had an unrelated nightmare. The routine definitely helped a lot in that continual process of checking the closet before tucking him in, but I never stopped checking that wall. I'd run my hand over the spot where the hole was, making sure it was still sealed, but it always was. And then one day I saw a truck outside the widower's house. No goodbye, no explanation, and the house stayed empty, and it took a while, but we actually heard that he'd passed away. And as horrible as it is to say, I actually felt relief. The hole was gone, and so was the sicko who put it in there. But the fact that it even happened in the first place, that there's people out there who'd think to do something like that, that's something I'll never be able to come to terms with. A few years ago now, my wife and I welcomed our first child into the world. We were living in a one-bedroom apartment at the time, and while that was certainly okay for a young, childless couple, we knew that we'd need more room to start a family. We started looking online and eventually found a suitable property in a pretty prominent part of our home city, but for reasons of our own personal security, that place will remain nameless for the rest of this story. The homes in this particular bit of the city were built by Celtic migrant workers almost 100 years ago now and are known as being sturdy, reliable, and affordable places to live. As you can imagine, they were incredibly popular with just about every other wannabe renter, so when me and my wife saw one of the houses there was available, we jumped at the chance to book a viewing and put a deposit down. About 6 weeks later, we were moved in, and it felt every bit the milestone that we thought it would. Our neighbors were warm and welcoming, and apart from the occasional busload of tourists, the area itself was actually nice and quiet. But then, the landlords proposed a rent hike. We were still very fresh when we got the news, so at first we had no idea how to really approach it. But then, right as we were approaching full-on panic, we got the news that a renters' union was undertaking a little investigation on our behalf, and we had to wait a few weeks to get the news, but when we did, we were over the moon. The landlords were backing down on the rent hike, and we were only going to be looking at a 3% annual raise instead of a whopping 12%. Neither me nor my wife had any inkling of what the renters' union had discovered, and we assumed they'd found some kind of bylaw that prevented the landlords from such a steep hike. But nothing could have prepared us for the truth. Nothing at all. The news about the rent hike was a stressful time for us, so I wasn't surprised when I started having these weird, recurring dreams. I just never expected them to be so vivid. The dreams would always start with me returning home from an errand, such as food shopping or a haircut, and I'd turn onto our street to find our house unlike I remembered it. All the other houses were the same regular red brick with copper brown trim, whereas ours was just jet black all over. The roof, the brick, the doors, even the windows appeared to have been painted the deepest shade of coal dust black I'd ever seen. I'd approached the house with the neighbors watching me from their windows and open doors, but as soon as I unlocked the front door and walked inside my home, the dream would end and I'd wake up. I told my wife about the dreams and the things that I saw in them, but she agreed it was probably the stress of the move playing on my mind. Now, I tried eating better, getting more exercise, and even stopped drinking alcohol altogether, but the dreams still wouldn't go away. They just visited me less frequently. They weren't exactly a hindrance at all. I could still go about my business as usual, but seeing as I'd never had any kind of reoccurring dreams before, it was definitely something that played on my mind a fair bit and made me wonder if I should just go and see my GP about it. Now, part of the reason that I reckoned that I could carry on as normal was because I work from home. I was head of a customer service department for a major electronics chain over here in the UK, so 90% of my job involved working from my home computer to take calls and resolve tickets. And this suited me down to the ground, as not only could I put in long hours with relative comfort, but it meant that I could look after our baby daughter while my wife was at work as a nurse. She also worked very long hours, you see, and very hard too, I might add, so it meant a lot to her that I could stay home with our daughter and make sure that she was well looked after. And so one day I'm working downstairs in the living room and my daughter is watching cartoons. I made myself a cup of iced coffee and then set it down on the coffee table in the middle of the room. But then the next thing I know, my daughter kicks her legs while bursting out laughing, and she boots one of the table legs and the coffee goes spilling all over the floor. It was a full cup, one of those big plastic coffee shop cups too, so almost a full pint of iced coffee was spilling all over the hardwood floor. I rushed to get some paper towels and the anti-stain spray, not wanting to lose any money by voiding our deposit. But then when I got back, I noticed something strange about the spillage. It was sort of forming a puddle. The puddle was a rough circle, forming in the center of the floor, and every time I'd take a wipe at it, the liquid would take the shape of that same rough circle again. I quickly realized there was a very subtle dip in the floorboards, one that must have been hidden with the rug that we'd moved when we decided to redecorate the room a little. And not wanting to end up getting charged for it, we reported the discovery to the landlords immediately. They sent someone over right away, just a general handyman I think it was, and after a quick inspection of the floor, they told us that we need some serious work done to prevent the floor from rotting away completely. Using one of those tiny tube cameras, the kind that you feed into small places, the inspectors were able to determine that a series of short wooden supports had rotted away underneath the floor. These had been attached to the home's foundations, but only in one section which appeared sunken, kind of like a well. And in short, we could get a hotel around the corner for about a week, and after maybe 3 or 4 days of work and a subsequent inspection, we'd be able to return our baby daughter to a safe, clean, stable home. But unfortunately, that's not quite exactly how things went down. We did as instructed and booked ourselves into a small hotel for a week, a very bare-bones place just a couple of miles away from our new house. Then, about 3 days into our week-long stay, we got a call from one of our neighbors saying the police were outside of our house. Not just any police either. They were in a forensics van wearing those all-white coveralls. I drove over as soon as the wife got home from the gym because obviously I needed to know what was happening in our new house. But when I got there, the police turned me away at the door. They'd take my phone number and they'd be in touch once they knew what the situation was. But for the time being, we were in the dark and I had to stay away. It took a week before the landlords called us to let us know that the work was completed. When they did, I demanded a personal inspection before we moved back in, and the woman who called agreed to share everything she knew when I met her at the house. When I arrived, a brand new matching floor had been installed, and everything looked just as I remembered it. I obviously didn't test the new floor by pouring a drink over it, but I was assured that the foundations had been renovated and that the issue was now resolved. It was then that I asked what caused the police to come round, because if it was serious enough to involve the law, it was serious enough that we needed to know about it too. And that's when the woman sat me down over a cup of tea and laid it all out for me. First thing, they were offering a rent freeze for 3 years if we promised not to talk about this until after we'd moved out. And since we've been moved out of that house for a number of years now, I'm obviously free to talk about it now. The second thing was that the woman had sworn statements from not one, but 2 council-approved structural engineers, both of whom were happy to attest to our home's safety and security. So if we did choose to move back in, we could sleep soundly knowing that there were no structural issues. Those were all well and good, but what I wanted more than anything to know was to find out what was under our floor. And then after signing my half of a 36-month rental agreement, she spilled the beans quite spectacularly. Almost 100 years ago, when the streets and the houses were still brand new, a family had welcomed a child into the world, but this child was not one they had expected. I can't remember exactly what the poor child's condition was. I'm not even sure the authorities had it entirely sussed out either, but it was clear that whatever it was as debilitating as it was severe. She couldn't walk like other children, she couldn't talk like other children, and by every estimation, she didn't act like other children either. Then as a result, she never made it into double-digit ages. It's also clear that whatever happened to the poor girl, her parents couldn't find it in themselves to take her to the local cemetery. Maybe it was just too expensive to hire an undertaker or whatever, and maybe they had a hand in her death. Either way, they evidently decided the best place for their dearly departed daughter was under the house they built with their own hands. Since there was no one left alive to question and no one left alive to charge, the police simply moved the girl's remains someplace that they could properly dispose of her. After that, they closed their investigation and allowed the renovations to recommence. Then, after a week or so later, there I was, sitting in that exact same space, talking myself back into moving back in. There was just enough time for us to back out if we really wanted to. My wife still had to sign her part of the form as the second adult occupant, but even once I'd explained the whole situation to her, she thought the same thing I did. It was too late to start the whole process of moving again. Doing it one time had been exhausting, so facing it all over again was just kind of unthinkable, even if that did mean staying in a house where the 100-year-old corpse of a severely disabled girl had been recently found. Once my wife had signed her half of the paperwork, we moved back in the next day, and over the next couple of weeks, I stopped having those weird dreams where I'd find our house had turned that sort of inky shade of black. The scariest part of the recurring dream was this. I'm a grounded scientific guy, but I don't have a hard time explaining the dream. Before the renovations, when there was an illegal burial site under our house, who knows what kind of mold or spores or decay could have been drifting up from that sepulcher underneath our feet, affecting my mental state or that of my loved ones. I had dreams, similar dreams, but they were never quite the same. I'd turn onto our street after running whatever errand I'd been on, only to find our house looking the exact same as all the others. No one would be watching from their windows, no one would be peeking out from around their doors. I'd just walk inside as per usual and then wake up feeling refreshed and clear-headed. And things carried on like that for years, as if nothing had ever happened. And then one day, me and my wife decided that we wanted a little more room, and we moved into a 3-bedroom house a couple of miles away from the first. My daughter still doesn't know what they found or why we had to move out of that new house for a week, and I'm not sure she remembers any of it to begin with. Maybe I'll tell her one day, or maybe I'll show her the video you end up putting the story in if you do end up using this. Hopefully it'll make it an easier thing to handle, but I think the word hopefully is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. My name is Terry, and this is a story from back when me and my family moved into our first real home together. So back in 1994, my wife and I and our 2 kids moved into a big house down in a quiet Texas town. The house was very old but very beautiful, with huge bay windows and a massive backyard. And the yard was maybe half the size of a football field, and it was filled with thick grass and old trees. But while my wife, Angie, and I told ourselves we'd explore every inch of it before we moved in, we had much more pressing issues at hand. And so the whole thing got put on the back burner until much later on. We loved the open space, and as long as we did the occasional snake check to make sure that there were no rattlers around, The backyard seemed like the perfect place for our two kids to play. And that house felt like a fresh start, a place to make memories, and for the first few weeks, nothing could have been better. But then, my two kids found something that changed everything for us. Sarah Jane was 10 and Jack was 8, so they were just as excited about that backyard as we were. Once we made sure that there were no unexpected hazards and we'd given most of the lawn a little trim, the kids were free to chase each other around all over the place. But then one afternoon, they came running inside looking very excited. Then, when their mom asked them what was going on, they explained how they thought that they had actually found buried treasure in the backyard. I followed them outside, curious and not worried at all, and they led me to a spot near the back of the yard where we'd had a gardener trim back the bushes. And there, half buried in the ground, was a heavy metal door. It looked old and rusted at the edges, with a thick lock holding it firmly shut. And I hadn't noticed it before. Angie and I must have missed it, and the landscaper must have thought that we knew about it already. Now the kids begged to open it, but I told them to stay back. Jack said that it was buried treasure, left there by a pirate, and I told him whatever it was probably not any kind of treasure. Pirates keep their treasure in bank accounts these days, not underground in chests. And the door looked heavy, but after clipping off the lock with a pair of bolt cutters, I managed to pull it open, which revealed a dark staircase which led down under the ground. And the air smelled damp, cold, and rotten, no place for any kid to be. So, after making them promise not to go down without my permission, I grabbed a flashlight from the house and shone it down into that hole. And the steps were concrete, and while they looked pretty worn, they appeared very sturdy for their age. I told the kids to wait where they were, and I assured them that I'd share anything I'd found and then went down alone. Now just seconds later, my flashlight was lighting up a small room at the bottom. But it wasn't just a room. It looked more like a bunker. It was small, just a single room with concrete walls and a low ceiling. A metal cot sat in one corner with a thin, stained mattress lying on it. And then there was a rusty sink bolted on the wall and a toilet attached to the same wall close by. The fixtures looked very old, just like everything else, but when I walked up to the sink and turned one of the faucet knobs, water came out. Water that was both clear and cold. I figured the place had been abandoned long ago, that maybe it was some Cold War relic that had thankfully never had to serve its purpose. But I was wrong. Someone must have been living down there, and pretty recently too. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering when I pulled its chain, and that's when I saw the scratches on the walls. Deep and uneven, like someone had clawed at them with nothing but their fingernails. Suddenly freaked out by what I'd seen, I climbed back out and closed the door behind me. The kids were waiting, very wide-eyed and excited to hear what I had to say. And so you can imagine their disappointment when I told them that the bunker was entirely off limits. And they tried to argue with me at first, and I had to scare them a little to make sure that they listened by claiming that there might be monsters or even mean wild animals living down there. And that didn't feel great, having to spook my own kids, but as any parent will tell you, you sometimes gotta lay down the law if you want to keep your kids actually safe. And that night, my wife and I talked about what I'd found, and we agreed that not only should we stop the kids from ever seeing what was down in that bunker, but that we better call the cops to let them know what we'd found. The bunker was very unsettling to me. You see, to me, it wasn't just some normal place for storms or maybe even bombs. It might have been built for that, and it might have also served that purpose at one time. But when I saw it, it was almost like a makeshift prison cell. The scratches, the cot, the working plumbing, I felt like they told a story that I didn't want to know. It felt like a secret that we didn't want to be a part of, and we didn't want that secret in our new home. 2 sheriff's deputies stopped by the next day after we called. They followed me to that bunker, and I showed them the metal door in the room below. One of them wrote down some notes while the other asked a bunch of questions, and they checked the sink and the toilet, noting that the water was still working, and agreed that that was probably not a great sign. They also found a small chain bolted to the floor near the cot, something that I hadn't seen during my first visit down there. It looked kind of rusted, but it was still very strong. and my skin wanted to crawl off my bones when I saw that. Stating the obvious, one of the deputies said the bunker was likely used to hold someone, and probably against their will. They didn't say much else, but their faces were obviously very pale as they said this, and they told us that we weren't in any trouble, that we'd done the right thing in reaching out to them. But for the time being, we were to keep that bunker locked. They would investigate and let us know if they did find anything. And that same day, I drove over to the Home Depot in town, bought a brand new padlock, and relocked the door to that bunker. I told our kids obviously to stay away from it. They nodded, but I saw this very deep curiosity in Jack's eyes, like it was another conspiracy to keep him away from the treasure that we'd found down there. And it made me glad that I bought that padlock. It was the only thing stopping him from going down there and seeing all the stuff for himself. And at that age, seeing dark stuff like that can have a terrible effect on a child's mind. The house felt different because the yard didn't feel safe anymore. And I tried to forget it and move on, but every time I was out there in the yard, my mind went to that bunker and all those scratches on the wall. Who had been kept down there? For how long? And most importantly, why? The cops called us back a few days later, but they didn't have the answers we needed. They said they found no records of the bunker anywhere in any files or documents related to the property, and the home's previous owners also claimed no knowledge of it. They were all the way up in Oklahoma and had never visited the property. And then the folks who likely had it built were dead, and there were basically no one to talk to or question that had any solid answers for them. And as a result, the sheriff's department couldn't say who built it or when. And they also found no evidence of a crime, so even if there were folks around to arrest, there was really nothing to charge them with. They told us to keep it locked for safety reasons, and that naturally, we had the right to concrete it over if we wanted to, maybe to grow a lawn over it, anything we wanted. And I remember thanking them for the time, but also thinking that it was all just kind of pointless. That bunker stayed sealed, like a very dark secret that we kept buried in our backyard. I checked the padlock every week, making sure that it was staying, and I didn't want anyone or anything getting in there, least of all one of our kids. And years had passed by, and the kids started to grow up, and the bunker stayed off limits, but I knew that they probably still thought about it, especially our son. Sometimes I saw him glance at the bushes that we grew in the backyard, right over where the door was hidden. He didn't talk about it often, but it was always there, almost like a black mark that we couldn't ever wash clean. Angie and I tried to make life as normal as possible for Jack and Sarah Jane. We had backyard barbecues, played some football, and succeeded in filling in the house with joy and laughter and some happy memories. But that bunker was always in the back of our minds, and how could it not be when it was just right under our feet? And as the years passed, Sarah Jane and Jack moved out. Sarah Jane went to college, while Jack got a job in another city, and the house felt empty without them. But I was glad that they were finally away from that thing. Angie and I stayed there, but the house felt a bit too big now, and anytime I was out in the backyard, I just avoided that corner where the bushes hid the door. One night, I woke up at maybe 1 a.m. to take a bathroom trip. I figured that I'd heard it when washing my hands, but when I turned off the faucet, I heard it. The slow scraping sound, like metal on stone, and it was coming from the backyard. I quickly made my way downstairs, grabbed my pistol with the little flashlight attachment that I had bought specifically for home defense, and then went out in the backyard. It was cold and almost pitch black out there, but after walking across the lawn, I pushed through the bushes near the back and checked the lock on the bunker door. The padlock was still there, but the dirt around the door looked disturbed, like someone had been digging. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon, but I couldn't convince myself, and a part of me thought that maybe it was Jack, but that seemed insane. Another part of me thought that it was whoever had owned the house before, maybe even the person who had been kept down there. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, your gray matter is turning blue. Like a lot of 80s and 90s edgelord alternative kids, I was heavily into Marilyn Manson in the 90s and 2000s. I was a fan of the band from the beginning and kind of fell off when Eat Me, Drink Me came out, but everything up to and including Golden Age of Grotesque was my era. As anyone who was a Manson fan of the late 90s and early 2000s know, they were one of the bands that had an official forum on their website. For noobs, a forum, or BBS as we call it, was basically like a band-related subreddit with different sections, where you could post threads similar to Reddit. Official forums for bands barely exist anymore because there's all sorts of legal culpability for what gets posted on them these days. But back then, it was basically a free-for-all. Some very insane stuff went down on the Marilyn Manson forums, with people posting extreme shock images and remaining unbanned, or shocking photos of themselves or hurling abuse at each other, making the most offensive edgelord jokes you can imagine, and it was glorious. And I was a girly girl who loved pink and rainbows and prom and stuff, and also loved darky, edgy humor and Marilyn Manson and far harder and darker music. I thought that this made me so unique, and so my online persona was based around being a glittery pink princess in a world of goths and monsters. And what do you know? The goths and monsters loved it, and me, and appreciated the subversive nature of the joke. Cool, I did a funny. And I was a bit of a novelty when I registered on the forum, and immediately got taken under the wing of the cool kids, people like Perfect, Skinny Puppy, Stigma, and a sardonic lesbian called Katie, a skinny guy from Scranton who wore a tutu called Gordy, the DXM Queen, those types of people. And I was bullied by men with names like Celibate Adam, Mugwump, Cranboy, and Derek, but it was all in good fun, and I bit back. We all hated each other with loving affection, and to this day it was one of my favorite communities I've ever been a part of. I think it helped because 3 of the cool kids, Perfect, Skinny, and Katie, were actually kids I knew from school. I'd overheard them talking about the Marilyn Manson BBS and told them that I was a fan. They didn't believe me because I was a cheerleader and theater kid, so I signed up and demonstrated my knowledge and showed that I was down for the lulz, and that's how we became friends. We didn't really hang out IRL, but it was nice to know that some of my online friends were also my school pals if I ever did need to chill with them. One member of the Manson forum was called Jordy Dark. He'd regularly post pictures of himself. He had this thick milk bottle glasses, a porn star mustache, huge sideburns, a mullet, and the lankiest, skinniest, palest body you've ever seen. A very odd-looking fella, but kind of interesting. And we never really hung out, but he'd sometimes comment on my posts with things like, heh, or nice, or lol. And one day, Jordy sent me a private message asking when we were going to start chatting. I was down to chat with anyone, so I said, well, now is fine, and we began talking about music, of course. And surprise, surprise, we shared a lot of the same tastes, which is pretty expected when you meet on the message board of a band. There were about 4 things we talked about: the Blair Witch Project, Marilyn Manson, Hole, the band, and the X-Files. We were both big fans of all of these things that, for alternative kids, was very mainstream. Jordy took this as a sign that we were absolute soulmates, though, and every single day after that, he'd commented on all my posts as if though we were best friends. He'd also send me lengthy private messages talking about, I don't really know what, really. The weirdest part was that he'd decided that I was depressed, sad, anxious goth girl who was a danger to herself and needed to be lifted out of her pit of misery. At no point had I ever suggested this. Just because a lot of other girls on the forum were like that didn't mean I was, but it seemed like Jordy had just decided that I was as a means of saving me and didn't even care that it wasn't real. It was intensely infuriating having a guy talk to you about your mental health disorders and depression that don't even exist, treating you like a patient who he can save with his love and care. I could ignore it in PMs, but he started commenting like this on my posts too. It became really irritating, especially when others would try and interact with me and joke around, sometimes aggressively, sure, because that was how we interacted in fun. But he would rush to my defense. He'd warn people to leave me alone, threaten them if they insulted me, and it started making me look bad too. I didn't want some creep defending me like this, especially from people I consider friends. I tried to tell Jordy a bunch of times that I didn't want this, and he flat out told me that I simply didn't know what was best for me due to my mental illness. And he said that I was numb because of the medication. I'm like, bro, I don't even take aspirin. And I started to ignore Jordy after this. Unfortunately, the BBS software didn't have a function where you could block individual people. The only way they could stop messaging you was if they got banned. It wasn't really something we did, reporting each other to the admin, and it was generally considered a big no-no, so I didn't file any complaints about Jordy. We encouraged mob justice, which meant that me and my friends would clown on Jordy. We'd call him a loser, creep, and weirdo whenever he posted strange crap about me. Jordy didn't care though. He'd just reply with a heh and continue posting his strange, poorly lit photos of himself where he looked like a 70s serial killer. In one of the last private messages Jordy sent me, he told me he forgave me for how my friends treated him. He said that he wouldn't let it get in the way of our life together and that one day he'd come and rescue me from these creeps. Like I said, I was in high school at this point, in my junior year. Perfect, Skinny, and Katie also went to my school and they were in their senior year, which is another reason that we didn't hang out in school really. One day I was in class and got a message from the office that my dad had arrived to take me out of school due to a family emergency. Weird, since my dad walked out when I was 3. I have a stepdad though, but it was unusual that he'd introduce himself as my dad. We got along great, but he was Leon, not Dad, and that was fine. Maybe the office just screwed up though. I got a pass, left class, and headed to the office. Even down the hall I couldn't see Leon or anyone. The secretary said that my dad was out in the parking lot and that she was sorry to hear about my aunt. I did have a crazy wine aunt living in another state, my mom's sister, so my heart flip-flopped as I rushed into the parking lot. Once there, I froze in my tracks. There was a filthy-looking camper van parked up across the 3 spots. It was covered in faded flower power graffiti and some lewd imagery of women. Leaning against the camper van was a guy I both recognized and didn't. It was Jordy from the Marilyn Manson forums, but it wasn't exactly him. Remember I said that in his photos he looked like a serial killer from the 70s? That's because those photos likely were taken in the 70s. The guy who stood lounging against the camper smoking a cigarette looked like Jordy but aged 30 years or more. His long hippie hair was gray, and so was his mustache, and his face was a map of wrinkles and lines that suggested hard living and hard drugs. He wore filthy bell-bottom jeans and a cowskin vest, open over his bare pigeon chest, and I kid you not, he looked like a hippie who hadn't changed his clothes or washed since 1969. I stopped short, but elderly Jordy caught sight of me across the parking lot. His deranged face split into a frantic grin, and he began striding toward me. He called out my forum username, and that's when I knew that it was definitely him. He began ranting about how he'd finally come to save me and take me away from the filth. And I began to back away and told him to F off. But he came over to me and grabbed my wrist, hard. I yelled at him to get off of me, and by now some other students and faculty were beginning to pay attention. I saw a friend I recognized and yelled that this dude was some random guy off the internet and he was trying to kidnap me and to please go get the principal, the cops, or whatever. They ran off and Jordy began dragging me towards his stinking, dirty camper van. God knows what depraved fate lay in store for me behind those doors, and I screamed and tried to pull away. But for an old guy, he was incredibly strong, and his sandaled feet slapped over the parking lot as he heaved me towards his serial killer murder van, or so it seemed to me at the time. Out of nowhere, a voice yelled at him to let me the F go and back off. I turned, and my 3 forum buddies from school, Perfect, Skinny, and Katie, came barreling over. Skinny raised her skateboard and cracked Jordy across the back with it, causing the old board to actually break. Jordy let go of me and howled in fury. Katie swung her bag, covered in band badges and patches, and battered Jordy in the head, sending him back further. And then Perfect, the guy who was this tiny, short goth kid, displayed surprising strength by pinning hippie Jordy's arms behind his back and rushing him forward across the parking lot, slamming him against the minivan. Jordy then crumples to the ground, and Perfect pinned him down, yelling for security or really anyone. Katie and Skinny guided me away and checked that I was okay. I told them I was, and then mentioned how wild it was that Jordy had literally tracked me down from the forums and arrived here. They were floored. They had no idea who they'd been fighting. They'd just seen some old guy dragging me across the parking lot and ran to my aid. They hadn't even paid attention to who it was, but as soon as I told them, they realized I was right. It was him. The cops came and he was taken away, and the 4 of us got to go home for the rest of the day. The first thing we did was talk online, and finally we did report this to the forum admins, who banned Jordy immediately. The others really wanted to post this epic tale to the forums, but we realized that it probably wasn't a good idea since it was an ongoing investigation and it probably would show where we're from. And to this day, I have no idea how Jordy actually found the town that I live in and the school that I go to. He insisted I told him, and also claimed that I'd asked him to come collect me from the school that day. It was my word against his, ultimately, and as much as I hated having to let things drop, there was a talk of him trying to push assault charges on my friends if I didn't. Ultimately, I had to let this potential predator go free, and my mom and stepdad were absolutely furious about all of it. It kinda sucks knowing that Jordy didn't face any real repercussions for his actions, and I have to really hope that it was enough to snap him out of whatever kind of weird stupor he was in, and make sure he left teenage girls alone. So I've been a listener for a few years now. I have a story I've always wanted to share with you, but I've never been able to bring myself to actually write it down and send it in because it kind of makes me sick to my damn stomach. So my lovely wife, who introduced me to your channel, has finally convinced me to send it in, so I hope your listeners get a few chuckles, or more likely shivers, at the completely effed up thing that happened to me, my sister, and my mom when I was a kid. Do you remember AOL Instant Messenger? It started off as an instant messenger client for people who had AOL as a service provider, but eventually anyone could use it. It was the messenger program of choice for the 90s and 2000 kids, with the creative away messages you could write and being one of the first that let you choose your own user picture and username display. You could also customize it so it would give you alert pop-ups for specific people in your friends list too, and you could assign any sound file you wanted as the alert noise. And because of what happened, I genuinely can't hear the audio clip of Cartman saying, "Screw you guys," without cringing and feeling a little spike of panic. Her name was Gloria, which sounded made up even then. I don't know why, but I could never believe that someone my age would actually be named Gloria. And she insisted it was her real name, though, and that she was named after the Laura Branigan song. And that's funny, I said. That's my mom and stepdad's song. Small world, she said, and suggested it was fate that we became friends. Gloria messaged me a lot, always after 9 p.m. She told me she had various clubs and a lot of commitments. Her birth mom lived across the country and barely saw her, and her biological dad had died a couple of years ago, so she was stuck living with her strict Christian fundamentalist stepmom. I told her that I had a stepdad, but we got along pretty well, but it was firm and fair, and my mom, on the other hand, treated me like the baby because I was. And we'd been online friends for a few months by that time. I started telling her things about my family, and I trusted her a lot. She'd first added me on AIM, which let you find and add random people as part of a feature it had that would never exist these days. A few of the instant messenger programs used to revolve around meeting new friends online, like IQC, IRC, Yahoo Messenger, etc. Gloria had added me as a friend one day and I'd accepted, because she just did that back then. It was before the days of Facebook and things, and when everyone's real name was attached to their profiles. It was totally normal to chat to a rando, and if they were a freak, then you just blocked them and moved on. It was the Wild West, and we weren't as careful as we should have been. But in some cases, that led to surprise long-term friendships. And that's what I thought was happening with Gloria. A genuine friend for life. And this all went down before cell phone cameras were a thing, and most kids didn't even have digital cameras. But I'd seen a couple of photos of her scanned from her yearbook photo, and I'd sent her scans of my class photos as well. And I came to really value Gloria's company. She was there for me when I was having a hard time at school with one of my teachers, and she was there when me and my friends were being targeted by a couple of guys in the grade above. She listened to me lament about my lack of love life, even though I was kind of vague about this at first as a shy 15-year-old. And one day I told Gloria about my sister, who was a few years older than me and graduating from high school that year. Lacey is a good kid. And I say kid even though she's my senior, but I feel protective of her like that. And she was back then too, but in her senior year she was stressing about graduation a lot and the upcoming anxiety of college, and she started turning to very mild substances in order to cope. She was just taking something similar to Adderall and occasionally dabbled in prescription painkillers, but none of them were things that she was meant to be taking, and so I stressed and worried about her. As a 15-year-old, I felt it a bit lame to tell my 18-year-old sister that I loved and cared about her, so I told Gloria instead. After that, Gloria kept asking about Lacey a lot. I didn't like this. It made me a bit jealous as well as protective, and I guess Gloria picked up on that because she started to be extra nice to me. Love bombing, I think the kids call it these days. She'd ask me to hang out with her almost every night, playing Habbo Hotel and Club Penguin and various flash games. I started to develop a real strong bond with her, and I genuinely came to deeply value her company. I guess Gloria valued mine too, because one Friday in the November of my sophomore year of high school, Gloria told me that she'd fallen in love with me. I didn't really know what to say. I loved Gloria as a friend, and I didn't feel that way about her. We'd never met, for one thing. And instead of breaking her heart, I suggested that maybe we could talk on the phone. Gloria freaked out at this and actually blocked me for a hot minute, and I felt awful. I'd somehow offended her and had no idea why. Had she been able to tell that I didn't feel the same? A few days of feeling lousy went past, and then "Screw You Guys" played from my computer, that Cartman sound, and Gloria was online. And I felt a little nervous and a little panicky. We talked long into the night. Gloria spun a strange tale that didn't make a lot of sense, and I'm not going to bother repeating it because, spoiler, it was completely made up. Short version though, the idea of speaking on the phone terrified her, but she was down to actually meet in real life. She said she thought things could be a lot easier if we'd meet up and talk. This sounded like a terrible, dangerous idea to me, so naturally, as a 15-year-old boy, I agreed to it immediately. We decided to meet in a park near my house, and I asked her how she knew where I lived and how she could be there when she lived across the state, and she told me that there was something that she needed to confess to me, but I shouldn't be scared. She was still the same Gloria I knew and trusted. Obviously, I was very suspicious, but I'd known this girl for months. We'd shared everything. We were close friends. Even if she had a dark secret, I could look past it. Maybe she was a friend from school who was too shy to admit who she was. Maybe she was a dude. Honestly, I would have been fine with Gloria being a boy my age. Maybe he had gender confusion issues or something, but what I didn't really consider was the possibility that it was worse, and then worse again. I showed up to the park a bit early. The sun was just beginning to set, and I started to realize that even though we'd picked a public place to meet, the time and area of the park meant that nobody else was really around. It was a small parking lot and abandoned store on the edge of the park with a couple of benches I could wait on. And I sat there, and eventually a car pulled into the parking lot, windows down, blasting "Thy Unveiling" by Insane Clown Posse from the open windows. I remember this vividly because I'd been hella into that band and that CD in particular when I was in middle school. This was a few years later, and I'd stopped listening to the album, but someone who knew me and was trying to impress me but hadn't really paid close attention for the last few years, could feasibly play it to win me over. It wasn't just the song that caused my mind to go there. I also recognized the car. It was the car I'd ridden to school many times a few years ago, listening to that very CD and refusing to enter into conversation with the man in the driver's seat, my stepdad, Mom's then new husband, Carl. Carl pulled the car to a stop, climbed out and walked over to me, Insane Clown Posse still blaring from the stereo. I cringed. It was obvious what had happened. Carl had found out that I was meeting Gloria, a stranger from the internet, and had decided to intercept me. How did he know? Did Mom and Carl have some kind of parental lock or monitoring on the computer? Carl sat down next to me, and the truth was way more horrifying. Carl was Gloria. It had started out as a way to keep an eye on me and what I was getting up to online, and then he started enjoying being Gloria. He began digging his double life. I didn't want to believe it at first, but he was able to perfectly recount every interaction I'd had with Gloria. It was way more direct than if he'd read our chat logs or monitored our conversations. Only the other conversation participant could be this aware. At first I was mad that my stepdad was keeping an eye on me. Then I remembered the event that had led to all of this. He, Gloria, said he was in love with me. I asked Carl what in God's name had caused him to say that. And Carl looked sheepish and almost shy, and then his face started to turn red. And in that moment, Carl changed. He'd always been kind of a pushover. I never really respected him because I thought he was less of a man than my dad had been, and he let my mom push him around too. He certainly wasn't an abusive, cruel, or strict stepdad, but how he physically grabbed me by the collar, dragged me towards him, and hissed in my ear. He said if I told anyone what he'd said or done as Gloria, then he would ruin my sister's life. I felt a cold, sick feeling in my stomach. I'd told Gloria all about Lacey's struggles. I didn't think it mattered because I thought Gloria was a kid my age on the internet who lived on the other side of the country. But no, she was my damn stepdad, and now my stepdad had about 1 million pieces of damning info about his stepdaughter Lacey. We rode home. ICP was still playing and it drove me nuts, and eventually I asked Carl what I could do to keep the peace and make sure that he left Stacy alone. And I was feeling sick and terrified. I'd lost my best friend Gloria, and worse, found out that she'd never even been real. But I'd also screwed my sister over in the process and found out that the stepdad, who I'd always considered a non-entity, was a complete creepo. Carl said he wanted to keep up the facade, that I had to continue talking to him as Gloria, pretending he was a 15-year-old girl whenever we spoke online. And something about this chilled me to my absolute core. He'd already confessed his love to me. What did he mean by keeping up the facade? How far was he expecting me to go with Gloria? And at first I really tried, for Lacey's sake. Carl kept up his persona of Gloria almost perfectly, just letting it slip enough to 100% prove to me it was in fact him. Comments like, "See you at dinner," that could have looked innocuous to anyone reading the chat logs, or a vague reference to something he'd said in person. There was no doubt that he was Gloria, but for the most part he kept up the pretense of being my 15-year-old female internet friend, a very affectionate friend. I don't really want to talk about that part, and thankfully it could have been a lot worse. But Carl Gloria definitely did start trying to push things further with me, and that's when I broke. I couldn't take it anymore. I confessed it all to Lacey one night when we were alone in the house. I expected her to be furious at me and to kick my ass, but she was totally chill and understanding. She explained gently to me that her drug problem was extremely minor recreational use and she hadn't taken anything in months, so even if Carl did try to expose her, there was really nothing to expose. She said it was very sweet that I was so worried about her, but kind of laughed at me for being overly cautious and neurotic and really sensible. And that was great news though, because it meant that I didn't have to tolerate Carl anymore. And that night, Lacey and I assessed his computer. His password was our mom's date of birth, and found chat logs between Gloria and a whole bunch of other kids online. And from what we could tell, Carl had been talking to at least 5 or 6 other teenage boys as Gloria. He'd never taken things irreparably far yet, but there was at least one conversation where he was beginning to try and encourage this one richer kid to use his allowance to buy a digital camera and send him revealing photos. We printed everything out that night before Carl could cover his tracks and then showed it to our mother. She obviously was horrified, and the next day, Carl was gone. Mom handled everything. I know law enforcement were involved, and I don't know if at the time laws allowed for Carl to be monitored for catfishing, as back in the early 2000s online laws were obviously pretty patchy. And Carl died in the mid-2010s, alone and single, thankfully. I kept an eye on him all these years because I promised myself that I'd never allow him to actually hurt a kid. I can't be sure that I succeeded, but it seems like he kept his head down until his death, so I feel like I did my job as best I could till he passed away of cancer. These days, it's very easy to verify who you're talking to, but as for us 2000s kids, things were different. I know plenty of friends my age who have had similar unpleasant experiences with adult strangers online, and my advice is not to suffer in silence. Talk about it. It really helps. Trust me. So something very strange happened to me a few years ago. Because I can't tell it without giving away some identifiable information, I can't say exactly where it happened, but it was a major US city. I don't think I'm in any danger from telling the story, I just have a very good reason to be cautious. I've been furloughed during the 2020 pandemic, and my stimulus check was starting to run out. I'd split up with my boyfriend because living together in lockdown had revealed that he was a massive Jordan Peterson guy, and before I blocked him on Facebook, I think he was getting into QAnon. So I was starting to get worried about money. I got into a routine of waking up and making some black coffee and then checking all the job listing sites for remote work. When nothing turned up, I'd usually hit one of the few gyms that were still open. Working out made me feel like that I still had some control over my body. And that day was different though, because before I could open my crossword app, I saw a Facebook message about an exciting new job opportunity with flexible hours and daily earnings up to $1,000. It was a multi-level marketing scheme to sell overpriced makeup. I blocked and reported them for scams and thought that that would be the end of it. There was a new girl at the gym that day, but she seemed to be more interested in her phone than working out, probably trying to choose the right selfies to post. I tried to ignore her and worked on my arms. After showering and changing into a strappy top and leggings, I went to the nearby Starbucks for a frappe. There were some more scam messages, which I didn't even bother reading this time before blocking them, and there must have been about 5 different accounts, all with the same kinds of messages and the same profile photo of a woman in her 30s with lip fillers and pretty good eye makeup. It was about this point when I realized that she was in the coffee shop, only about 3 tables away. I froze. I went to that gym almost every day. I was in the Starbucks nearly as often, and she had to have seen me here, probably got my name from them calling out for my drink orders and guessed the rest on Facebook. And this was no coincidence. Another terrible thought struck me. I googled the makeup brand, 0 results. And that kind of company is almost built on search engine optimization. There was no way that it would have had a digital footprint. And like most people, I didn't know much about multi-level marketing companies. The scale at which most of the recruiters message people is a little frightening, and you're told to find up to hundreds of people each day and tell them their unique qualities make them suited to the MLM. So when I found out that the MLM company wasn't even real, it made a lot more sense how she'd had the time to do so much research on me. I later found out from friends and ex-coworkers that she'd been messaging them, asking questions about me and just giving a very weird vibe. I was so shocked that I almost ran out of the coffee shop. And of course, she followed me after taking a sip from my unfinished drink. I asked her what the hell she was doing, and in the end, it turned out to be about a man that I'd just forgotten about. She claimed I'd stolen her ex, and in reality, he'd never told me that he was in a relationship, and when he proved to be useless in every way that mattered, I ended it. The next week, I'd seen him with another woman, and I barely even cared. I didn't steal her boyfriend, and she would have been better off without him. I tried to tell her as much, but she was clearly obsessed with me now, and it didn't really matter how she'd started. It felt very strange trying to run away from her without wanting to make it obvious that something weird was happening, and as if by not showing it, I could avoid the situation that I was in. She didn't seem to care about that, so I was forced to run away from her. Not sure where else to go, I ran for the subway with her not far behind. And I thought back to my wilder teenage years as I cleanly jumped over the turnstile, leaving her scrambling to pay the fare. And I ran down the platform and jumped through the subway car doors and tried to make my way along the packed train. Just as the doors were closing, she made it into the car, and I waved at her as the train started to move and walked back up the steps to get a cab home. I don't have my name on any social media accounts now, and I deleted most of them. Even if you could work out who I am from this, you'll never find me online. I don't really take selfies anymore, not on any public accounts, and of course I got multiple restraining orders on her, but I still don't want to take any chances. Unless she's gotten the help she needs, then she's probably stalking someone else right now. I have a very close friend who tells me I need to move because I resent having to keep a file on my own stalker. And I'm only writing this because I think if she escalates again, that she might get caught. I'm from Old Blighty, and I've got a proper corker of a yarn to share with you today, old chap. Just kidding, we don't actually talk like that, but that was the first message I received from the girl that I'll call Handcuffs. She said that she'd seen my MySpace and liked my photography and thought it was funny that I came from Old Blighty. She was fascinated by British slang and British culture and kept making weird British jokes to me, calling me old chap and that kind of stuff. And I found it pretty enduring that a hot alternative Californian chick was impressed by my Britishness, and I figured the rumor was true, that American chicks dig British guys despite our awful teeth and love of bland cuisine. And I was even more impressed when Handcuffs told me the site that she'd worked for. You can't actually say the name on YouTube, but let's just say that it's a modeling site that still exists to this day, which could be known as Unalive Lasses, if you catch my drift. And you probably get it by now. Handcuffs told me that she was an unalive lass, and sent some photos that did indeed suggest that she was such. And I could see her on the public version of the website, but a number of the photos were definitely from the paying members only area, if you catch my drift. And of course it didn't really occur to my dumb hormone-fueled self that someone could have just subscribed to the site to save those photos and send them to me. The inclusion of some candid personal photos sealed the deal for me, and again, stupid as I am, I didn't really consider that whoever Handcuffs really was, they could have just found other photos of this unalive lass who was a public figure. Me and Handcuffs talked for a while, and then she confessed her love for me. And I believed this, obviously, because I was an arrogant little sod who thought that I was a great catch for a Californian glamour model. And I started getting more suspicious, however, when she became dead set on flying me out to Cali to meet her. And that seemed too good to be true, but hey, what's the worst that could happen? A free trip to California? Then she said that because of the way the exchange rate works, she could only buy a ticket from the UK to California using GBP, and her bank account didn't allow her to exchange dollars for pounds. Therefore, I'd have to send her the ticket price in pounds, and she'd send it back in dollars. And she knew my bank account would automatically convert it because Lloyd's Bank did that apparently. Why a Californian unalive lass was supposed to have insight into the functions of Lloyd's Bank is something I'll never know. But hey, at least it was a good tell that started to open my eyes. I asked her if she could possibly send the money first because I was a little strapped for cash after getting my Peugeot modded. At first she said that was fine and even claimed that she'd done an international transfer, so I should send the money over in the meantime and her transfer would appear in my account later. Yeah, no thanks. I told her I'd have to wait until her transfer came through, and she started ranting about how I didn't really love her and how I wasn't gonna get some if I didn't make the effort and try to appeal to my, baser instincts. And as much as I wanted to believe that I'd be sinking into the bed of an unalive lass, I also wanted to believe that I'd have money to live, so I told her that I genuinely could not send the money back until I had it. Of course, no money showed up, And then she surprised me by saying it was fine. She'd managed to buy the ticket anyway, so I didn't need to worry about the money. I asked her if the plane tickets would be arriving at my house, and she said no. She hadn't been able to arrange that, so I'd have to pick them up from the airport on the day of the flight. I told her that I'd prefer to have the ticket in hand before driving all the way down to Heathrow, or at the very least, could she email me the receipt for the ticket so I knew everything was kosher? And again, she flipped out at this, screaming over instant messenger and hurling some of the worst written abuse I think I'd ever seen in my life. Hell, at this point I didn't even care if she was genuine, Californian hot girl or not. Never stick your head in crazy, as they say. And so I told her to have a nice life, blocked her, and moved on thinking that I was no worse for wear. I did kind of miss her, or miss the things that I'd imagined getting up to with her, but it was whatever. And a few days later, I was strolling through town with a couple of the boys when I heard a female voice yelling my name with some absolute venom. I turned to look, and an ex-girlfriend from year 8 came bounding across the high street. Lucy was a large Wiccan girl who had been a smaller, quiet girl when we dated. We just kind of drifted apart after just a few weeks, simply not vibing, and I'd never even thought about her since. We were in 6th form college now, and I saw her around at times, often being quite loud and mouthy, and was always glad that I dodged a bullet with that one. And now she was storming over to me, swinging her big woolen black bag, pentagrams jangling around her neck, mascara smeared around her eyes. And she came up to me and jabbed me in the chest with a porky finger, hollering at me that I had no idea what I'd missed out on, and that I'd regret not paying her what I owed her for the heartbreak. She began screeching that she was going to put a spell on me and my friends, and that my genitals would fall off. Then she mentioned a few things that only Handcuffs would know, and that's when I realized. Handcuffs was Lucy, my weird Wiccan ex-girlfriend from year 8, and I'd been successfully and decisively catfished by this crazy bitch. My mates would give me the ribbing of a lifetime about this later, but right now Lucy seemed genuinely unhinged and dangerous. She was talking as if she genuinely believed that she was Handcuffs, and had at least summoned or manifested her, and that if I'd just sent her the money to pay her rent, then everything would have been forgiven and we could have gone back to being in love. I asked her what needed forgiving, and she said the fact that I broke up with her. In year 8, lady, like 5 years ago, and we just drifted apart, so I yelled at her, and it absolutely broke her brain. Lucy full-blown leaped on me, slamming me to the floor, and I felt my head hit the side of a granite bench as I fell, and blood began to trickle from my skull. And on top of that, I could feel tiny, sharp pains in my chest as she began to stab me over and over repeatedly with a safety pin. It was more annoying than agonizing, and coupled with the crack in my skull, things were starting to feel very serious. I felt my friends dragging Lucy off me, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the hospital. Lucy had accidentally fractured my damn skull when she'd pushed me, and I had a massive bleed on my brain. My chest was also really sore from being stabbed by a damn safety pin, and my parents told me that Lucy was absolutely mortified about nearly killing me. Lucy's parents were insisting that she went into a voluntary rehab stint. Apparently, she'd been pretty heavy into drugs and alcohol, and this was a wake-up call for her. And it was up to me if I pressed charges, and ultimately, I decided not to. But that is the story of how I got catfished, stalked, and almost killed by a fake unalive lass who almost unalived me. For a bit of a happy ending, Lucy went through a stint at rehab and got better. We're not close or anything, but she's a mother of 2 and a fitness instructor now and living her best life. We keep in touch sporadically, though, for class reunions and stuff, and she has an incredibly dark sense of humor like I do, so we're able to joke about her almost killing me. In fact, it was her idea that I write this up, and she proofread and signed off on it. Some of the more damning descriptions of her were added by her, and she said that I should send it to a True Scary Stories channel, and so I settled on sending it to my favorite lad who would never catfish anyone. Let's read. So I've been a listener for a long time, and I've come into your live streams sometimes, and I'm ashamed to say that I've left a few comments laughing at some of the submitting authors for being idiots. I've always felt a bit guilty about it because deep down I know that I'm just projecting. As about 8 years ago, I got myself into a situation with a weird internet creeper, and I know it really was my own doing. I guess it's easier to take out my frustrations on others than admit fault. My friend Allison warned me about this guy named Jeff. And yeah, it was my own stupid fault. I admit that up front. And Allison told me, "Hey Shan, I met this guy on such and such Facebook group, and he started being all weird and intense with me." And she told me he was into swords and horror and all sorts of edgelord things. She told me that Jeff had mentioned me a few times and that he thought I was interesting. She said she thought he'd been trying to hit me up next. And she was right. He did. And my bored, stupid self, against my better judgment, allowed him to strike up a conversation with me. If you've ever been on the internet at all anytime between the 2000s and the late 2010s, you'll know guys like Jeff. Intense, serious, quick-to-anger anime fans who love The Killing Joke, Sin City, Firefly, and Arma. They hate the MCU and any mainstream superhero thing. They claim to be huge comic book fans but get all their information from the Nolan Batman movies. They're an embarrassment to genuine comic book fans and nerds and people who understand why the Joker actually is a cool character instead of why meme lord incels think he is. True ones understand. And Jeff was not a true one. His favorite game of all time was BioShock Infinite, and this is not to insult that game, but it is relevant and will come up later. And when Jeff started talking to me, it wasn't actually as bad as I expected. He was surprisingly fairly interesting. He had a rudimentary interest in the same things I did, the same comics, movies, anime, and video games. And at first, the cracks didn't show. But then the more he talked about these things, the clearer it became that he was getting all his information from probably Wikipedia or a handful of movie adaptations. He'd make definitive, sweeping statements about media that was just completely wrong or misinformed. For example, he went on about how Batman was his favorite superhero because all of his rogue gallery was totally grounded and normal, nothing weird or comic booky. And this was only true in the movie adaptations, but to an OG Batman comics fan, it's a ridiculous thing to say. I made the mistake of pointing this out to him, and he got super mad and started yelling at me that the comics didn't really count, Weird. Now, I only knew Jeff online, thank God, but every time I'd come online, I'd find lengthy messages from him. After just a week of knowing him, he'd write elaborate essays about how close we were and how much I meant to him and how grateful he was to know someone like me. We had known each other for probably a week at that point. The close friendship he'd imagined in his head soon seemed to sway towards the suggestion of a relationship. I had absolutely no romantic interest in this guy and had made it very clear to him that I wasn't looking, but it was like he heard what he wanted to hear. Multiple times he tried to impress me by crowing on about how he had to break the heart of his last girlfriend because she wanted to sleep with him, and he'd lectured her about how that was inappropriate. When I asked why it was inappropriate, he let slip that he, in his early 30s, had been dating a 16-year-old girl. Not just online either. They were dating in person. And he very smugly told me that he wouldn't sleep with her because it was illegal though, and she was a bad person for wanting to get with him. Okay, buddy. That's the child at fault for sure, I bet. And this is when I decided that I didn't really want to be friends with this weirdo anymore. And one time I told him I was sick and that I wouldn't be online for a while. And after 5 days of frantic messages from him, I kind of snapped and said, "Dude, I was sick." And he kept replying saying, "I knew it. I just knew it." And then proceeded to ramble on about how we had a freaking psychic connection and how he had the same thing with his beloved grandmother and could always tell when something was wrong with a loved one, so he had simply been able to tell that I wasn't okay. Oh right, it was a psychic connection and not the fact that I literally told you 5 days ago. Next, when I wouldn't reply, he began sending me messages saying that he was having severe chest pains and then narrating his journey to the emergency room and leaving vague hints that he had only hours or minutes left to live. The first time, I stupidly fell for it, and then he would simply do it every time he wanted attention. But there was never any follow-up to these medical disasters. An absolute clown man. And when that stopped working, he began to spin sob stories about various elderly relatives he lived with who were on death's door. The problem was, he couldn't remember the stories that he'd spun. So one month it was his beloved granddad who'd raised him who was dying, but the next month it was his grandmother, and then it was his brother, and then his dad, and none of them ever actually did die, and most of them never even got mentioned again. It also contradicted the fact that he previously told me that he lived with a roommate who stole a ton of money off of him but still lived with him, and also that he lived alone. It was just completely nonsensical gibberish, all designed to evoke sympathy. He'd write lengthy attention-seeking diatribes on Facebook about how everyone he knew always wanted to take from him, and how he was an untapped well of positivity and generosity, who was literally incapable of being mean, that he genuinely had some kind of condition that meant that he couldn't be unpleasant to people. And yet somehow he was always managing to condemn women and girls for their behavior, choice of dress, etc., or calling other people fake fans of things he liked, even though he had the most rudimentary understanding of most things. And eventually, it all became too much for me. He'd go on these rants about how desire was disgusting and inappropriate, but also keep trying to hit on me. He'd send me random poorly lit photos of himself. Nothing risque even, just weird photos of him in a hat, and then ask for lengthy opinions on how good he looked, and if he felt like I hadn't said enough, he'd just keep pressing and pressing. Now again, let me stress that I met this guy online for about 6 weeks, and in the end, I told him that things were way too intense for me, and that while I'd be happy to try a friendship with him, we just didn't have the same kind of relationship where we were actually close BFFs or more like he seemed to keep insisting. This was of course my fault, and he lost it with me, getting ragey and angry at the fact that I'd said that I was willing to be his friend. Now why would I say that if I wasn't? I tried to explain to him that being someone's friend doesn't involve constant trauma dumping, attention seeking, and claims of psychic bonds. But he was having none of it. He started swearing and cursing at me, so I blocked him. Later, he messaged me on Steam apologizing for what he was about to do. It wasn't clear whether he was going to do something to himself or to me. I wasn't too concerned about the latter, though. We lived in totally different countries, and he was far too broke to fly here and do anything to me. Of course, nothing came of it because guys like him are all terror and bluster, and instead, he posted a huge rant on Facebook about how if you have a beautiful songbird in a cage, it's your duty to let her fly free. It was a quote from BioShock Infinite, and he decided I was Elizabeth from BioShock and he was, I don't know, her dad? Yeah, way to make it even more creepier, pal. It was a pretty terrifying experience, even if I can look back on it and laugh at him. Having someone that toxic in your life is horrible, and I've severely learned my lesson about believing people like this are interesting. And I hope the same can be said for my third friend who decided to befriend Jeff even after all of what I'd told her. And last I heard, she'd cut him off because he was trying to convince her to cheat on her husband with him. When I was much younger, I used to hang out on various internet forums. Now, I won't share the names of them because I have no idea if some of them still exist or their archives can be tracked down, and I don't want my dumb teenage self to get me canceled in 2025. Now, I don't actually remember where I specifically met Baghead. It may have just been on Twitter now that I think about it. And he quickly started cropping up on a few places I frequented though, but that wasn't too unusual since most of my online social group came from the same places. It was definitely Twitter where he'd first reached out to chat with me though. And now I'm pretty guarded and savvy about people wanting to befriend and talk to me, but back then I was kinda happy to chat to anyone, which is a big mistake. Baghead wasn't the first weirdo who latched onto me through my forum use, but he was most definitely the most intense. After a few days of talking, he began to hint that not only was I his soulmate, but he was most definitely mine too. If you've never had someone try to convince you of that, there's a pretty big difference. And when someone's trying to get with you, it's easy enough for them to list all of the things they like about you to try and flatter you. Now, Baghead did all of this, but he also constantly talked about the ways we'd be compatible. And hopefully you can imagine what I mean by that. And I stress that I did absolutely nothing to provoke this kind of conversation. In fact, a bit of backstory about me, I have no interest in that kind of thing whatsoever due to some deeply unpleasant events in my childhood. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that I can be extremely traumatized by intimate talk and intrusive intimate suggestions. I learned very quickly on the internet that, in the words of a great philosopher, not to be some woke asshole, but women have it hard, man. And that's why every time I made a new friend, especially a guy, I was always very upfront and clear about the fact that I only wanted friendship. Actively wasn't interested in romance or more and simply wasn't wired that way. And I wouldn't become friends with a guy until I was sure that he understood this. Baghead assured me that he understood this and sympathized, and even had a sister who was in the same position as me and blah 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 blah. I'm not sure I ever really fell for it, but you can still see why that it was a bit of a shock when, after a week, he sent me a lengthy confession admitting his love for me. If it had just been that, I think that we could have moved on from it, but he also included some fairly explicit descriptive talk about things that he'd like for us to do together, things that just hadn't ever been discussed between us. He also drew some very gross anime-style fan art of me, which pretty much unsettled me. And it was completely unprompted. I was horrified, but stupid me, I tried to explain to him that we didn't have that kind of relationship and that I didn't want to have that kind of interaction with him. Now, I can totally understand Baghead being disgusted at his mistake. I kind of expected him to disappear forever after this. Instead, he threw a huge pity party tantrum, ranting and raving and screaming about how much of a terrible person he was and how he ruined everything, how he destroyed everything beautiful, and how no friendship could ever last because of his stupid head. He said he wanted to cave his own skull in and cut his own face off and all sorts of extreme frantic stuff. At the time, I was young and dumb and naive, like I said, and didn't realize that this was an emotionally abusive attention-seeking technique, so my stupid ass was genuinely concerned for Baghead. Naturally, I went out of my way to reassure him that it was okay, that he hadn't screwed anything up, and that I'd still be his friend. I told him I didn't really appreciate the weird fanfic about me, but I hadn't clicked on it, so it was no big deal. Baghead calmed down but started sending me photos of himself, clearly not wearing a shirt, and asking what I thought of his face and hair. And he had long, messy hair and was clearly proud of it, and beyond that, he was just a normal, stocky dude. Not bad looking, but like I said, I'm not wired that way. And I told him he looked good though, trying to just be nice, and that was clearly a mistake. He kept sending me more and more photos, mirror selfies that showed off more and more of his pasty chest. And it ended with half of our conversations just involving him spamming me with selfies and asking what I thought of his face and hair. And what was I supposed to keep saying? Eventually, I told him it was getting a bit much and that I didn't really know what to say in response to all the identical selfies that were getting more and more bathroom-focused. And I very gently suggested that I'd prefer that he would wear a shirt in them, you know? And this led to another absolutely terrifying meltdown. This time, he sent me messages and posted tweets talking about how he should cut his heart out of his chest, carve loser into his flesh, cut his hands and arms off, and then finally cut his face off again. This time, I wasn't quite as intimidated by it because he'd made these threats before and never so much as even slapped himself on the cheek. But it's still pretty horrible to hear an adult male screaming about how disgusting he is in voice notes, especially when you know that the implication is that you made him feel that way. Once again, it fell to me to try and make him feel better and assure him that it was fine. He hadn't ruined our friendship and all that stuff. And he acted really sad and volatile for a day or two, and I was starting to worry that maybe he actually would do some harm to himself. And that's when he messaged me with a request that would make him feel better. His self-confidence was at an all-time low, he said, and the only way he saw himself getting out of it was if a female friend could give him a confidence boost and tell him that his unclothed body was attractive. Yeah. He was asking to send that kind of photo so I would say that he looks good to help his mental health. And this was too much for me. I told him that I would prefer that he didn't do that and that it's something that he should save for a future partner. and then I just hid offline for the next few days. Now, during this time, he had an absolute meltdown on social media, making vague references to how his toxic self had ruined yet another friendship, and how he was a negative and cancerous presence in other people's lives, etc. All very intense, scary stuff for a young woman like myself, and I ignored it and pretended that I didn't see it. And after a few days, he sent me an offline message asking if I was okay and if he'd done anything wrong. Not wanting to get into drama, I told him that he hadn't, and I was just going through some really difficult PTSD things. Baghead told me he understood and that he'd leave me to it. The next day, I received an email from Baghead, and I expected some kind of drama or hand-wringing, but instead it was a video file and a single sentence that said, "To cheer you up." I did not click on that video file because I know better than to open unknown video files emailed unexpectedly from weirdos. Instead, I asked Baghead what he'd sent me, and as blunt as you could imagine, he told me it was a video of him enjoying himself in a solo manner that he'd made for me to cheer me up and make me feel better. And I was so horrified to the point that I was actually mad at him, but I also knew how volatile he got and how he threatened to hurt himself every time I rejected him. I decided that I'd just politely say that I wasn't really interested, and then just slowly stop communicating with him. If I blocked him on instant messengers, he wouldn't know because I usually set my status to appear offline anyways. And I told him that I wasn't going to watch the video and reminded him that I was specifically dealing with childhood trauma, so it wasn't really my type of thing. And instead of losing his mind for a change, he actually started lecturing me on how it would be good for me and how it would make me feel better and how I really should just give his video a watch to see if I enjoyed it because he was confident it would essentially fix me. And I hope it's clear at this point, but Baghead didn't really know me that well or have any insight as to why I wasn't interested in this stuff, beyond him being creepy and weird in the first place. I just told him I wasn't and that I don't feel like he was owed any answers. And all I'd say is that he was absolutely off the mark and there was no way that this was an appropriate thing to subject me to. I'm calm about it when I recount the story, but at the time it was genuinely really weighing on me. Baghead was a volatile, angry, pushy guy. He had this whole shtick of understanding women's struggles, but used it almost exclusively to talk down to me, and then act like he could fix my trauma essentially by sending me all sorts of disgusting imagery of himself. It was gross, terrifying, and overwhelming. So I stopped speaking to him on Instant Messenger, and he did not take this well. To start, I still followed him on Twitter and Facebook because I was terrified of the drama that would result in me blocking or unfollowing him in a way that he could see, and he fully took advantage of that. And the week after I refused to watch his creepy video, he posts thousands and thousands of words of rants on Twitter and Facebook. And at first he kept talking about how he always drove people away, and how he was a toxic poison. Quickly though, he started blaming a third party, me obviously, and ranting about how everyone took advantage of him, spat on his kindness, manipulated and dismissed him, blee blah blue, cry me a river. And he was clearly trying to make me feel guilty as hell, and it almost worked. Instead, something kind of snapped in me and I just got really, really mad. In retrospect, this was my first big experience with a guy being persistently creepy to me online in a way that encroached on my personal space and threatened to affect me directly. Since I'd never really dealt with anything quite like this before, I wasn't sure how to handle it, and decided that it would be just better to tell him that I needed to cut him off rather than just do it and have him discover I'd blocked him by chance. Part of me was really worried that he could track me down where I live. He lived fairly close by, definitely feasible to just drive to see me, and these days it's not too hard to find someone online if you really want to. I DM'd him on Twitter and said, "Hey, this is really doing a number on my mental health, and I can't keep seeing this on my feed, so I'm going to unfollow and block you, but please just move on and leave me alone, and I won't call you out for harassment and all of that." Then I unfollowed him, gave it some time so I could be sure that he'd seen my message, and then blocked him too. I didn't look at his feed for some time myself, but a few days later, a friend I'd told about the situation let me know that Baghead was posting some pretty extreme stuff on his Twitter. He was again talking about how sick he was of being walked over and taken advantage of, and that on Monday, everything would change. People would look at him differently, and they would know that he was a serious person who wasn't to be messed with, and that the person who'd recently trampled on his heart would discover the result of her actions. And I was sick worrying about this. Was he threatening to harm me or himself? I asked my friend and even my mom if they thought that I should try and report him to law enforcement and all that, and I didn't actually know his real name or address. I just knew the state that he lived in, so what could I do? A relative is a local cop, so I at least let them know that this guy was potentially behaving threatening towards me. Thankfully, Monday came and I didn't have to wait for the knife to drop or the trigger to be pulled. Baghead revealed the big dramatic event that he'd been foreshadowing. It was a haircut. He had a haircut, transforming his long hair into a short, neat, regimented buzz cut. And that was the dire action this chump took. And when I looked on his feed, he was a few tweets into rambling and a pretentious essay about how this was a new him and he was no longer going to offer his heart and soul to those who'd trample on it. And sure thing, friendo. Feel free to keep your heart and soul firmly in your pants going forward. And with that, I never looked at this creep's social media feed again, and thank God he never decided to escalate things with me beyond online harassment.